So we're back. We took a few days break as time was running long, and we are continuing now with our commentary for the Q&A session of Representative Click. All right, are you ready for this, Jeannette?
I am.
All right, let's cue it up and see where we got going on here. This is a follow-up question from Representative Humphries.
Thank you, Chairwoman. So this will be my last question, and it is literally just a question for you. Would you say that there is a major difference between hormone blockers and surgery or procedure? Would you say that there is a difference?
It's on the same train. It's like saying, is there a difference between the engine and the caboose? It's the same train. And so a child that's asking my opinion, and I respect you if you disagree with me, but I think the evidence demonstrates that once you start on puberty blockers, you will proceed to cross-sex hormones, and then you will proceed to top surgery or bottom surgery. And there's a young lady by the name of Kira Bell. There's links. Please watch that. It's so sad. Kira Bell is 23 years old, a biracial young girl in Great Britain. And when she was a young girl, her mother, she was a tomboy, and she was attracted to females. And her mom said, you think you're a boy? And she said, well, maybe I am. And so she started on that hormone blocker regimen. She started on the opposite sex hormones, and she transitioned as much as she could she had the top surgery. She had the double mastectomy. And then she regrets it. She sued Tavistock, which is the hospital that performed that surgery. But when you see, there are videos, there's links to videos, which I would beg you to watch that, because Kira has a voice deeper than mine. She has a better 5 o'clock shadow than I do. And she looks very masculine, even though she's trying now to go back to being a woman. She has a girlfriend. She just wants to live her life. But even now, we talked, one of the other topics used to be like the bathroom bill a few years ago. She tries as a biological female to go into the girls' restrooms, and people give her a double take because she looks like a man. And this is because she was advanced in this process when it wasn't right for her. And that's the kind of people that I want to protect, who is 18, 19, 20, however old, and they want to do that. If they're happy, that's it's okay. But I want to protect kids who are not able to give informed consent and who will later regret this. And today she doesn't even know she's going to be, if she's able to have kids or not because of this treatment. She won the lawsuit.
Okay. So it's a fascinating question to say, do you think that there's a major difference between hormones and surgery? And he could have said, okay, let's talk about hormones and then talk about surgery. But I think he went right to the heart of the matter, which is that when we talk about the irreversible changes of those major interventions, of which both hormones and surgery have irreversible effects on the bodies and therefore lives of the kids who get put on them or endure those surgeries, the concept of there being a train that you're just getting on, whether it's the caboose or a mid-body card, you're still headed in the same direction, you're still going there, is a really good metaphor for this. And oddly enough, it was the same metaphor invoked by the series of Swedish documentaries that ended up having them put the brakes on this. And that's reinforced by the studies in the more modern era that really changed the profile of the lives of kids that are experiencing gender dysphoria being put on two different pathways. And this concept again and again becomes relevant in this whole discussion, which is that it happens a few times where people will say, we can't do a randomized controlled study because it's just unethical to withhold treatment from some of these kids. We've got to put them on hormones, so we can't have a control group of kids without hormones. And even if you accept that premise, you do have the history of watchful waiting and exploratory therapy that was done in the past, where those hormones and the surgery and social transition was not performed. And so you need to compare anything that you're doing now to what that was. And when you do that comparison with starting these kids on puberty blockers, particularly, but then going on to the surgery, instead of the majority of the kids desisting, resolving their gender dysphoria without those hormones and surgery, it flips. And it's not just a majority of the kids go on to hormones and surgery after that. In the flip, it's almost 100%. It's 99 to 98%. So the intervention of starting those early puberty blockers and socially transitioning puts these kids on a train, that it's on a train because there's rails. They're not going off to any other direction. They're headed towards those surgeries. And people would say, well, what's wrong with that? They're finding their better self. But is that going to be true in the long run, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And the phenomenon of detransitioners is showing us that's not the case. Anyway, so any other comments on his response?
No, I think he has good analogies. So the thing that we see with Representative Click is he's very good at making it real for people. The thing that I think in this testimony, because this is almost a year ago now, 10 months ago, um, is the coming hearings, I think that we're going to see in Ohio. There's more data, there's more knowledge. And so I think he'll even expand upon the things that he's saying now, because what he's referring to in this train where she's asking about puberty blockers versus surgery, which seems like a huge difference. But we know that basically everybody turns out to be truly trans in that scenario. And that's the argument, right, from the other side, that for sure, then if these children are put on puberty blockers and they have time to, quote, decide whatever they're deciding, even though they were born that way, but they're trying to discern or decide what they're going to be, then they're able to proceed with that and they don't lose any time in transition, supposedly. So I can understand that argument working itself out to where nearly 100% of them transition. But we also know that social transition, the reinforcement of wrong sex pronouns, and the stopping of puberty disorients a person and makes them feel less like their peers. Of course it does. It makes sense that they would feel even more different and they would feel like, yeah, there is something wrong with me. And the reason they're feeling that there is something wrong with their body is because you have stopped their natural puberty. It isn't natural to stop puberty. So, of course, they feel like there's something wrong with their body. It is a drug induced wrong feeling. And then when you inject them with cross sex hormones or patches or whatever is super popular now, then of course they feel like there's something wrong with their body, because there is. That's what the drugs are doing to them. They're harming their body and they're becoming more and more confused about who they are and grasping for all kinds of things. So I'm hoping that Click then proceeds in these next hearings to bring up the data that we know is true, which is all of these children who we are psychologically and physically moving on that train. We know exactly where it leads.
Yeah. I mean, you pair that sense of alienation that they will get from their peers and from their own body with their access to social media, to online discussion forums, to a virtual world of support and celebration. And they're going to be drawn more to that at this moment in adolescence, where they already are trying to wrestle with the difficulties involved in puberty and so forth. And that's where the acknowledgement that there is a social contagion element adds to your understanding of just how this phenomenon plays out. And there's a hidden assumption in all of these answers and questions, which is that by putting these safeguards up, by calling for greater scrutiny, then we are somehow harming these trans kids. And so there's this assumption that all of these kids are trans. We just start with the assumption that they are true trans kids. And if that was true, if that assumption was true, then this would be a very different debate. But we know from history, because of the desistance rate and because of the detransitioner phenomenon, that all of these kids that we assumed were trans and therefore did these irreversible interventions on are not actually all trans. And so the point of these safeguards, the point of slowing down, is to say we've got to make sure that we are not assuming everyone is trans and treating everyone the same way, so that we don't harm these people. And that assumption, you'll see it again and again. What are we doing? We're preventing life-saving care from these trans kids. The issue is we don't know, and we can't tell. There's no lab test, there's no brain scan where you can figure out the true trans from the non-trans.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that I just wrote an email to a professor on that issue, and she used the phrase trans kids, and this is a clinical therapist with a PhD and 20 some years of experience. And I said, I think there's a current confusion about somebody who is diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is a possibly treatable, resolvable thing that people mostly, through puberty they resolve that dysphoria. And then there's this concept of trans or transgender, and I'm not sure those two things can be equated. So what exactly are we talking about? And we had that discussion early on as we started this series, and it's not clear what the difference is. So that said, you were talking about the concept of a control group and ethical experiments and all this stuff and withholding treatment. So the idea that every child who has some psychological distress or disorder is diagnosed 100% of the time is just not true. So let's say that there's a bunch of trans kids, or let's call them kids with gender dysphoria out there who were never diagnosed. They never got in any sort of medical system. They're just kind of out there with their lives, whether they have schizophrenia or whether they have depression or any of those things. They're not diagnosed with those things either. There's a bunch of people out there in the world. So we actually have a bit of an experiment happening now where we have children who may in fact be gender dysphoric. They are not diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I have a parent group where we have parents helping each other figure out how to address the psychological distresses of their children, whether diagnosed or not. And through that process, which is this similar process to what a family therapist might recommend as a course of treatment within the family, to say, okay, these are the ways in which you should adjust the environment around the child. And in those ways, we have children desist. Does that mean that they were truly trans and their parents are stifling their gender dysphoria, or they're stifling their transness? So they're resolving their gender dysphoria, and that seems like it's a gain. I thought that's what we were trying to do, is resolve the psychological distress. So I can't see what the ultimate goal is for the resolution of gender dysphoria in the giant scenario. But what I'm saying is, inside the family unit itself and in the world in general, we have a lot more kind of experimentation going on when we have parents intervening, parents taking steps to try to help their child resolve their distress. And we don't have any data on that, but no firm data. But I can tell you hundreds of parents whose children have desisted from their trans identity, whether or not they would ever have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria.
So the key takeaway I get from this for any future representatives or future families dealing with this issue is anytime you hear someone invoke the concept of trans kids, that should be a flag and an opportunity to have a discussion that should cover a number of topics, including how can you distinguish a truly trans kid from a dysphoric kid? Is that something that you can tell ahead of time? Shouldn't we more appropriately describe the experience, which is kids with gender dysphoria, if we can't determine true trans from temporary dysphoria? And if that's the case, should we be doing irreversible hormones or surgeries on kids, knowing that we do not have the ability to do this? And at the end of that discussion, there should be a concession of, okay, we cannot call kids trans kids. We can label the experience of kids with gender dysphoria and then build the discussion around the inherent conclusions from that. All right, so let's keep going.
Representative Caruthers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Click, always a pleasure to see you. And as Chairwoman Manchester said, I appreciate all your thorough research. I do have a couple of quick questions. Have you spoken to any hospital associations, any doctors in Ohio?
Oh, yes. Through the chair to the representative. Absolutely. In fact, it was a doctor that was one of the ones who asked me to do this. A doctor who has this situation in his family and is dealing with this. I have spoken with other physicians. Some physicians, to be quite honest with you, I talked to them about this and they 100% agree. And I say, would you like to come testify? And they're like, you understand that?
But not children's hospitals, not
So
hospital
and
associations.
perhaps you weren't in here yet at that time, but I have spoken to the Ohio Children's Hospital Association. They've been to my office. They're supposed to do a follow-up and take me to the hospitals to see those. I told them I'd be eager to do that. That was supposed to happen in January. It has not happened. I'm still waiting, and I will be happy to go into those. I'm not afraid of information. I want all the information possible. I'm not afraid of anyone or anything because it's not about me versus anyone else. It's about coming to the right solution.
Follow up?
Okay. This question comes up a few times, which is, did you talk to any of the clinics? Did you go to any of the hospitals? I'd have to say that strategically speaking, knowing that this type of question was going to come up, I would have liked to have had him, if he made the request to the hospital association and they did not respond, for him to have proactively gone out and visited the clinics, made his presence known, and rather than saying, may I come, just say, hey, I'm going to be coming at this particular time because this is an issue that's coming up and we need to have some answers for these important questions, so that he could respond in that way. I felt like that kind of weakened his position, though in the subsequent hearings, we get a little bit more of the other side of that, because there is apparently a hesitancy on the part of the clinics to provide aggregate data, to answer some of these really important questions, and they seem to hide behind the HIPAA as a shield, even though aggregate data does not have any personally defined information and so is not subject to HIPAA restrictions on communication. But was that your sense as well, being and hearing these questions? Because this is the first volley of that type of question.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to that argument of this isn't happening in Ohio. I can understand how people want data. They want to know what's happening. And I would like to know actually what happened in the meeting. He said that they came to his office and they discussed things. So I wonder what happened inside of that. But I'm more interested in documentation, like you said. I'm more interested to see the actual numbers.
So that concept there, that there are doctors who have opinions about whether or not this care should be conducted in this affirmation-only approach, who disagree with the trend of affirmation only, but are unwilling to come and testify because they're afraid of the consequences. That is a theme that shows up a few times, not just in the Ohio hearing, but just in the general discourse. And these things are discussed. It takes some bravery to get up and publicly have a dissenting opinion on this because of the potential consequences, where we can see even outside of just social media cancellation, people can have their positions or their jobs threatened for not towing the line.
And we're not, the thing is, we're not even talking about just losing a job. All of the people involved in these things are licensed professionals, from teachers to nurses to doctors to therapists. So they wouldn't just lose their job. They would lose their entire career and profession and maybe never be able to practice it. That's serious consequences. That cannot be overstated. I think that is one of the major holdups to people coming forward. You would have to have somebody who is in such a personal and professional position that they can withstand these consequences, the consequences of losing their entire career. It's serious.
And it's one of those systems where normally we look to the licensing system to ensure that our medical professionals are adhering to evidence-based standards of care. And if you get some quack nut job who's doing something for which there is poor evidence, which actually harms patients, then the fact that could affect their licensure is a good thing. But here we're seeing an instance where the evidence that was used to justify what are considered practice guidelines or standards of care is in fact poor, and there's an ideological element to how these things got approved and promoted. And so then you have clinicians who are stuck where they don't feel like they can ethically act on their own conscience and professional judgment because it may not go along with that affirmation-only approach. And so we hear from many families that they took their kids to a therapist. The therapist says, yes, there's gender dysphoria. I cannot talk to your kids about some of their other psychological comorbidities because that would be considered conversion therapy and I could lose my license. And so a lot of those doctors are saying, I'm just going to shuttle this patient off to the gender clinic because they're specialized in this. They know how to do that. And I've saved myself any risks professionally. But there's also I no longer have to challenge my conscience, my professional conscience on this. It's somebody else's problem. And so it's like just a tragedy of all these different forces coming together to put us in a system where we put these kids on this pathway that for many of them is the wrong pathway. And here we are.
Yeah, I don't want to scare licensed professionals who are watching this now. There is something great that they will get from speaking up. The tension that they must feel as they witness the harms to children it must be immense. I cannot imagine an anesthesiologist. I cannot imagine a therapist who feels like I actually know how to help this child, but I'm so fearful, especially if their parents are affirming. I can't imagine the feelings that a lot of these people, links in the chain, are feeling every time they get pulled. I don't know what that feels like, but I do know the freedom of telling the truth and saying, I think there's something wrong. Because when you do that, people surround you and you have other voices come forward and say, yeah, I see what you're seeing too, and I want to stand with you. And that's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So I think when Gary Click says the hospital association came to him, the hospital association is just another association, which are representatives. Talking to people on staff and meeting them, like you said, going up to the clinic and meeting with the staff and shaking their hand is a bit of an alert to the people that somebody is watching what they're doing. And there is a call to conscience there for sure. And you would hope that one of those nurses, one of those medical professionals would give him a call and say, I can't tell you my name, but I can tell you what's happening here. And that's the first step. I think it's just a matter of time.
I'm a physician, I'm a radiologist. And so I get the benefit of kind of hiding out in a dark room and only seeing shadows of patients. I don't have to directly deal with patients. But I've experienced that sense where we live in a world that is so complex, nobody can be an expert in everything. And so you displace accountability, you displace judgment to people who are specialists. And I could see that certainly as a radiologist, when the question of certain clinical interventions come up, I'm not a cardiologist, I'm not a nephrologist, so I leave that expertise to people who specialize in those things, and I don't have to worry about it. And for the most part, those things aren't controversial in the way that this issue is controversial. If you are a family practice doctor, a pediatrician, a therapist that's just a general family therapist, it can be easy to just say, I assume these other groups have expertise. I'm just going to defer to their judgment on that. Now that we're starting to hear this, I would just encourage you to say, hold on a second, before I defer to their judgment on that, let me look into what are the practice guidelines that they're relying on, how strong is the evidence there, and just realize that we're seeing kind of a bifurcation in the mental health world around this issue where there are therapists who are in gender clinics and they're just going to do the standards of care and everything. But then there are other therapists who have said, wait a second, the evidence that is guiding those standards of care and those guidelines is weak and poor, and the outcomes that we're seeing are not as clean as we would like it to be. And so we've got to look at this closer. So that's where we're starting to see competing groups of therapists say, we are taking a different philosophy, a different approach to this that is evidence-based, that acknowledges the reality of detransitioners and that acknowledges the long-standing history of desistance. And we're shaping our ethics, our philosophy, our approach to this issue with those things in mind. And that's where the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association can come into play. They have now released their own set of standards of care and guidelines for working with children with gender dysphoria. And so it stands in contrast to everything that is built up from the foundation that WPATH laid, which is plagued with all of the issues of the evidence being considered poor when you actually look into it. To condense that down, if you're encountering kids who have gender dysphoria and you want to shuttle them off to a therapist so that you don't have to practice outside of your expertise, just realize that which direction you send them in can have very significant changes. And you can go to the genderexploratory.com website and find a therapist that approaches this from that approach, or you can send them to a standard gender clinic that is just going to use the affirmation-only model built on WPATH and go down that pathway, and that can have a very significant difference.
We do see something that kind of undergirds everything, which is people are stupid and can't make decisions and they have to defer to experts. And this happened, I don't know, about 50 years ago. We had that same kind of idea that people are going to come out with manuals on how you raise your children as if people hadn't been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that parents somehow need to read a book to raise a child and that they somehow need to defer to somebody with a number of papers on the wall that have nice signatures and fancy lettering. That's crazy. We actually intuitively know how to care for other human beings. So even the nurses and therapists and doctors who are thinking, I guess I should trust that other person, I'm missing the part where they say, that seems wrong. It just intuitively seems so that something is wrong. And I kind of want to know more about that. Curiosity has been completely squished out, whether that's because of the time constraints on their lives, the responsibilities on parents or professionals. I have no idea. But the intuition, the time in which we sit, we reflect, and we feel that there is something incorrect going on. And then we have enough time to be able to do what you and I are doing, which is reflect on the things that we're seeing and pick it apart and say, what went wrong here? How did this happen to where I'm witnessing a 15 or 16-year-old girl get her breast removed by a surgeon? I don't understand. That just doesn't make sense to me. That just doesn't make sense. And I think we're missing that part where we somehow have been told that we are idiots and we know nothing. We know nothing. So what's my area of expertise then as a mom? What is it then? I know nothing about anything and I have to defer to experts on everything from bathing to food to what kind of shoes they wear and all of this other stuff. Really? I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
That definitely puts parents in a tough position, particularly because they not only do they just have this experience and intuition of what to do and what to be as a parent, but then they have the history of their kid. They were the ones that had to deal with their daughter as a 4 or 5-year-old demanding to be wearing pink all the time or purple all the time. And now they're faced with an adolescent who insists that they were really a boy the whole time and they've always wanted to be a boy. And so the parent has this discordant, conflicting historical account, and the histories are being written, and they're told from the clinician that if they don't affirm, then they are bigots or that they are somehow endangering their child. And it's just a really difficult thing to navigate as a parent when you're faced with this professional world telling you these things.
Yeah. What Gary Click says in there is he said, I'm not scared of finding out more information.
Mm.
And it's admirable. What he's doing is seeking out more information. And like you said, yeah, he should just show up. I'm not sure why there's any sort of clearance necessary to go inside a hospital and say, I'd like a tour of your facility. I'd like to know what's going on. And anything I see here is private anyway. I don't see the names of anybody, and anybody walking around and cleaning the floors doesn't see it either. So I'm not sure what the difficulty is with gathering information and being curious about what's going on. If somebody has nothing to hide, then they shouldn't have a problem with that. They shouldn't feel scared or upset or distressed about that. They should feel confident. They should feel welcoming. They should say, come, we're so proud of what we're doing here. And I'm not seeing that.
We'll get to their testimony in the coming days. And he's not even saying, hey, I'm going to barge in on a work day and come unannounced so that you guys will have to not see patients in order to see me. There's a process. And he mentions that they've already been to his office. So there's already been some indication there. And why there was no follow-up, because I'm sure when they came to his office, he said, we're going to be asking questions looking into this thing. So we should see some answers, or we want some answers, or we want some visits. So why there's no follow-up on that is a big question.
The bill, House Bill 454, is coming up in a new number. And wouldn't it be interesting if he still didn't get that tour? I don't know whether he has or he hasn't, but I'm interested to know.
And then a tour isn't really going to do much because it's really more about, it's not about the facility, the brick and mortar. It's about what are you doing when the patients are actually here? And this is the point, which is that when you're doing these types of interventions, you really should be keeping data on complication rate, desistance rate. You should have a sense of all these numbers because it's that type of feedback that is informing you as to whether or not your interventions are indeed effective. And especially when it's in this realm where there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of unknowns, it's still in an experimental state and an experimental category, which means we can't be sure that we know we're doing the right thing unless we're tracking that data. That's why it has to be very closely monitored. And if some state regulating institution comes in and says, we need some data, they should be able to provide it. They should be able to say, okay, we've had this many referrals, and of those referrals, this percentage subsequently desisted or were not recommended onto hormone therapy, and this other percentage were, so that they can give a sense of that. And that's where If we look to what happened in Sweden a few years ago, they went and asked those questions, and when they finally got to someone who would answer them, the answer was, it's been years since we've ever turned anyone away. We just affirm only. And so when that piece of information then was added to the history of desisters and all these other things, they realized that something was going very wrong in that gender clinic world for kids, and ended up changing their policies and having a marked reduction in the number of kids that went on to that hormone and surgical transition. So
I do want to comment. I know some other parts of your podcast address similar issues. So I did say that there's something helpful about Representative Click physically going, not so much just to tour the place, but to alert people that somebody is interested in what they're doing there. I know that happened in the Jim Jones cult, right?
oh
Government
yeah,
officials showed up, and that was a bit of an alert to people who were worried that they were trapped in a cult and that they couldn't get out. And that's the thing that I want to see. I want to see government officials going to places that get government funding. I think there's something really important that can happen at that point. There's a point at which you can get whistleblowers. You can get people who say, help me, please. I don't want to be doing this, but I feel like I'm a bit coerced. And I have a lot to lose, and I'm very scared. I think there's
that's
an
an important
opportunity there.
lesson. That's an important lesson from the Tavistock experience, where there were clinicians who had been in that clinic. This is the major gender clinic in the National Health System at the UK. And they did not agree with the affirmation-only approach that had just become the standard way they deal with this, where they had previously promoted a watchful waiting approach, but they felt like they couldn't say anything because there was pressure from the administration, there was pressure from their senior officials not to say anything. And so that's where, in that Swedish documentary, they're trying to get information from the Tavistock, and then the next day, one of the clinicians resigns and starts talking to the journalist about what he really felt. But he could only do that after he resigned, and it really took him knowing people are asking questions, looking into this, and it was his conscience driving him to say, I can no longer do this. There's also a documentary from Holland, a Dutch documentary that's on my channel, and there's another example there of a clinician who was involved in this work, saw it being affirmation only, and tried to move towards putting up some safeguards, and was told very soundly that's not going to work here. And they just could not, in good conscience, continue to work in that environment and treat patients in a way that they thought was unethical and doing harm. And so we've got people in the system now who probably don't agree with it, but feel afraid or disempowered to speak out. And so I think your point, relating it to those other environments where people have an element of coercion or just for whatever reason are not able to come out, that can be very helpful. All right, why don't we keep going on to our next question then?
Representative Gunther.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, Representative Click. We certainly appreciate it. Just for clarification, because this is a very difficult, challenging subject, and you've certainly taken on a heavy lift, we thank you for bringing forth this bill. But just so that we can clarify as we move forward, because this committee is probably going to be hearing a lot of information, but I want to back up for a moment and go to the motivation for this bill. You are a pastor. You wear another hat. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I do, through the chair.
And so I want to check with you. Are your religious beliefs the driving factor and motivation for this bill?
No, sir, through the chair. No, sir. If my religious beliefs were the motivation, I'd be baptizing everyone in here before we're done today and a few other things. I'm just trying to bring a little levity to that. No, sir. And there are people who, that's one of my experiences since I've been here or since I've been engaged, is there's a few people who, rather than give a good response, they just want to attribute this, well, that's his religion. You've been a pastor much longer than I have. I don't know if there's a verse that says thou shalt not transition. I don't think there is, because I don't think it was happening in the Bible days. And I am well aware of the difference in roles between the church and the state. But just because someone is a Christian, and I'm glad to be a Christian. Jesus Christ forgave me for all my sins, saved my soul, not because I deserve it, but by his grace. I'm not ashamed of that whatsoever. But I didn't come here to legislate my religion. That's not my role. That's not my responsibility. I believe in freedom of religion, but not freedom from religion. And even saying that, this bill does not have religious motivations. I just happen to be a Christian. I happen to be a pastor.
Follow-up.
Follow-up. Thank you.
All right.
That line, I did not come here to legislate my religion, is such a good one. It's such a good one.
What do you mean?
After spending hours with him, he's really spot on. He really does do that. I've never been a believer, never been a churchgoer ever, wasn't raised in a religious family. And working with him in particular, who's a pastor of a church, it's just so comfortable to me. I don't feel pushed or anything. And when I say working with, I say I'm available to support this bill in whatever way, whatever resources I can give to help in your interest in passing this bill, because it's really coming from him. And he's doing it out of whatever motivation he has from there. But the bill speaks for itself. There's nothing religious in this legislative bill.
I think it's interesting that this is a Republican member of the committee who's asking him this question. And it feels, looking at the strategery side of things, he's trying to get ahead of this question, just to in a friendly way, just say, we know that there are going to be accusations that this is all just because it's the religious conservative right that's trying to oppress the marginalized. And so let's confront that question head on. Is this completely from your religious motivation? And I do think he's straightforward in that he does have religious convictions, but he keeps that in his personal life, in his pastoral life, and that the text of the language of this bill, the data, the professionals that come and subsequently give testimony after being invited, they're not basing any of their arguments in scripture or in religious claims. It's all looking at the data. And so I think there may be reasons that people have questions that start in their own personal conscience from a place of their religious faith. But that doesn't mean that as they go on the journey of learning more about it, that all of their interpretation comes from the world of religion. And being not tied to a particular religious perspective myself in all of this, I tried to approach this subject from the perspective of evidence-based medicine and a scientific approach to how we can know things are certain. And that's where those red flags started coming up again and again. And so I think it's very easy to have questions and doubts and criticisms about this affirmation-only model for atheist people, for people who are not tied to any religious perspective. And it may take somebody who, like Click, who's going to have the bravery to stand up and ask these questions and bring a bill like this forward and drive this type of conversation. But it doesn't have to be framed in religious terms, and they do a great job of not framing it in religious terms here.
I also think that they must not have watched any other kind of legislative hearings and discussions to be able to compare Representative Click to people who actually do exactly what they're saying, which is they do take a bill like this and they do frame it in religious terms. I was at the hearings in Florida on the Medicaid not being used for such procedures, and it was a church revival. I was there with less than a handful of people who did not use religious arguments around this issue. So I'm not denying that it happens. I'm simply saying Representative Click did not do it and isn't interested in it. I think it's a way of dismissing everything that a person says. Once you stick a label on them, you say, oh, you're a pastor, so everything that comes out of your mouth must be because you want to save my soul. I don't understand that. And I don't understand how some label for somebody dismisses or elevates something that they say. It doesn't make sense to me. It's a shortcut to be able to do whatever you wanted to do in the first place, which is, I don't want to listen to you, Jonathan. So I'm going to say men are so ...
Yeah.
And then that's it. I've dismissed half the population. And then the other part, I'll say, oh, she's Christian. I just got rid of a bunch of people there.
You don't have to confront their arguments. You don't have to deal with anything.
They obviously don't have critical thinking. They cannot think properly because of X, Y, or Z label that I've attributed to them. It doesn't make sense.
And if you want to hear an example of what a religious argument would be, we're ramping up to another election season, and we've got former President Donald Trump out making statements that can be a preview to whatever platform he have. And so he's spoken out about this issue, but he frames it in religious terms. He says that there are only two genders, and we know because God created man and woman, and that's the two genders. So he's making an argument that would push back against a bill like this, but he's framing it in religious terms by invoking God. That is not being done in either the language of this bill or in the arguments put forth by Representative Click or the experts that come and testify on this regard. Okay, let's keep going.
you, Chairman. So the intent of this bill then is in no way to make gender transition procedures illegal. It is simply focusing upon the age and informed consent.
Through the chair to Representative Gunther, you're absolutely 100% correct. We are not trying to, and that's one of the things that we had in our discussions we had early on, is adults should be free to do as they please. Our focus is informed consent, protecting minors, adolescents, keeping them safe, hence the title, Safe, saving adolescents, not saving adults, saving adolescents from experimentation.
Thank you, Chair.
Right.
All right, anything to add to that? I think they're doing more work on just clarifying now the scope of this bill, because there's a conflation that happens where people say, well, you don't want anyone to transition. You must not think that anyone should have the right to do this. You're trying to close down all the clinics for everyone, but that's not the case. It's just looking at kids. And there's a reason we take special care for what we do to children, because they have of themselves not the sophistication, the maturity to make these important life-changing decisions. And because parents can be swayed by professionals, they are trusting and looking to the professionals to help them do the best for their children. And if those professionals have been brought off course by low quality evidence, strong political and social pressure, and just a distortion of reality, a distortion of how we see the human experience, then we end up with the situation that many of these detransitioners are facing as they come to the realization that interventions were done on them that were not properly vetted.
So I do want to comment on the name of the bill at this point, Save Adolescents from Experimentation, or SAFE Act. The other bills that were introduced earlier in previous years used terminology Vulnerable Children Acts, using the term vulnerable, which is also true. And I think that I would say that even though this particular bill hits a line at 18, we're seeing more bills in this coming year in 2023 related to people who are, in fact, of majority age, over 18, but still vulnerable and still within that range of prefrontal cortex development up to 25 or 30. So I think the language of the bill in terms of its title was a good move. I'm not sure where that language came out of, but I'm more in favor of safe. I think that's what we're looking for children. And even incorporating the word adolescent is probably a good idea, because that is the vast majority of what we're talking about. We're trying to stop what we see as a social contagion of people who are elevating a normal period of gender dysphoria, let's say, maybe not clinical, but a discomfort with the body that is quite distressing, that is a normal period of adolescence, and we're moving them towards something that actually harms them. So the language, I think, is important. The other thing that I want to note is, of course, they've talked about this bill independently, one-on-one, committee member to committee member. Gary Click has done his work, so we can see each of the committee members prepping and asking questions. And as much as I, and maybe you, don't want to believe that there is discussions that go on, and then he says, okay, Representative Gunther, could you ask me this question? Because I really want to clarify that. I want to be able to discuss that. In this particular case, it's quite obvious to me that he asked that question because he was asked to ask that question. I'm not saying that Representative Gunther wasn't curious about that and interested in it. And maybe they did have initial private discussions. Hey, Gary, are you doing this because of this? Because I don't think it's going to go well. And then maybe they had a private discussion and Representative Click said, no, I'm not. I'm interested in what's happening to children. And maybe that's the discussion that we're really seeing. But when you watch committee hearings, and particularly this year, and you watch people ask questions, take care to see whether they are genuinely curious about something on both sides. People who have maybe made up their mind on either side of whatever the vote is going to fall, whether they are genuinely curious, genuinely caring, genuinely wondering what's happening, or whether they just seem to want to proliferate whatever point that they're trying to make in order to vote yes or no. And it's not a critique. I think it's pretty clear what side I'm on. But it is clear to see somebody who is genuinely curious versus somebody who has prepared something to further their own argument.
That's a good point. Okay, let's go to our next question on this.
Member Denson.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. A lot of information to take in, and me onboarding, it's a lot of research to do. But I do want to ask a couple questions because the bill gets very specific about certain things. It gets very specific on how licensing bodies can punish, insurance companies can punish doctors, and how counselors communicate with their clients. Can you talk about your qualifications on overruling all of this expertise?
Thank you. Through the chair. I'm proud of myself. I keep saying that today.
Doing well.
Through the chair, to the ranking member. Thank you, first of all, for doing all of your research. And as with any bill that comes to this legislature, and I'm not sure how long you've been here, but you've been here longer than I have, I think. Bills like this are put together with collaboration with experts who provide that information and provide those resources. And that's how this bill was organized.
Thank you.
Followup.
Okay.
I definitely have a
Now-
comment on that.
Okay, what do you got?
The assumption that somehow, how is the government getting between doctors and patients? Right? The government is somehow interfering between these experts who are doctors, associations, people who know the medical profession, and the government is coming in and telling them what to do. That's how licensing works. The government controls licenses for professionals. That's how it functions. You have to apply to the government, your state, to get a license to practice. That is the function of government, is to regulate commerce, and this is a form of commerce. So I'm not sure how they think that somehow the government should not be in the business of regulating what's happening inside doctors' offices and therapy offices and schools. These are licensed by the state professionals, and the government should be and has been in the business of regulating. That's not new.
Your point is taken on that. I tried to put my libertarian hat on and to say, okay, hold on a second, though, because we have the realm of government, which has a role, but then the government has to defer to the clinicians in the world of academic medicine and evidence-based medicine because they are the ones who have the expertise in determining which standards, which practices can be endorsed because they've met a certain criteria for evidence-based. And that's where the circuitry seems to be all messed up here, because if the responsibility and the duty on the medical side of things of medical professionals to ensure that a practice is safe and that it is ethical and that it is something that we can apply to a particular patient, particularly vulnerable patients such as kids, then if that circuitry is messed up, then the government, if it is simply we defer to medical professionals in all areas, now we've got a problem because we may have patients who are then going to be harmed by the medical profession and there's nobody to put the brakes on it. And so that's where there's a dance and interplay between these things, because we've had examples in the past where the medical profession has endorsed and practiced things that are in fact harmful, and the state had to get involved in order to stop those things, whether it is certain medications that were widely promoted, medical interests were involved in it, financial interests, and ended up with birth defects. And so the government had to step in and draw lines around those things.
Yeah, what you're saying is true. This is not a new phenomenon. It isn't, I guess, as much as I want to believe in kind of the libertarian idea that everything functions well, there still is a role for government, limited or not limited, however you see it. There is still a function of checks and balances on what happens between the citizenry and people who run businesses or interact with the general public. Of course there is. So to say that somehow something isn't open to scrutiny means that it seems to me that somebody would wonder, why are they so hesitant for scrutiny? It just doesn't make sense to me. There's something odd about that. And if not, like I said before, you should take pride in your work and feel glad for somebody to come in and take a look.
And it goes back to Representative Click's statement that he's not afraid of new information. And that means you should be able to ask questions. There's no question that should be off the table. Because if it is right, if it's the right thing to do, if the evidence is behind it, then scrutiny should make it even more strong in its position. But if you close off those areas of questioning, then it does leave us in a position where bad things can happen in darkness that we could otherwise bring into the sunlight. Okay, so the other point I wanted to make was that just because government has oversight doesn't necessarily mean that things won't go wrong either. And that's where, when you look at the history of medical ethics, it's a dance and an interplay between government involved with health professionals in where things went really, really wrong, whether it's the Tuskegee Airmen experiment or the Nuremberg trials. In Germany, experiments were done on prisoners by physicians with the endorsement of government. And it's only when we reflect on those things and we say, wait a second, we have to have ethical guidelines, ethical principles with which we conduct the practice of medicine that draw boundaries around what is appropriate, what is not appropriate to do. We have to take into account the vulnerability of populations, their ability to consent, the degree of coercion involved in that relationship. And we have to shape our practice of medicine around these ethical principles so that we don't find ourselves going down these dark pathways that historically have happened. And I love that in this last question, they talked about this is about informed consent, because that principle of informed consent is such a huge part of the practice of medicine. It's really important that we pay attention to that. And that's where there's some publications that have come out just in the last few months looking at this question of, can kids actually participate in this informed consent process? And do the doctors who are giving them the information that would be required for informed consent, do they actually have the full body of information that they should have in order to obtain consent? And we assume that is true. And I might assume, if I was a family practice doc saying, okay, I'm going to refer them to the gender clinic, we assume that the gender physicians are going to give them all of the information that would be required for informed consent. But just like in these other countries, when they go back and look about the data that's presented, the strength of that data, and whether or not there were any historical experiences that were excluded from the data, that assumption is quite shaky.
Yeah, I'm not saying that the parents, even if we assume that children such as 14, 15, 16 years old are able to consent, which I don't think they are. And my understanding is that parents give consent and children give assent, meaning they don't say no. Then if you're starting something at, I think, 10 years old, 12 years old, certainly children cannot understand. And I'm not sure that they can even give assent to what's happening. I can't be sure that's possible developmentally.
My name is Chloe Cole, and I'm an 18-year-old detransitioner from the Central Valley of California. I started socially transitioning and identifying as transgender when I was 12 years old, and I was fast-tracked onto medicalization at 13, starting with puberty blockers and testosterone, before I went on to get a mastectomy at 15, and I stopped transitioning at 16 when I realized that I had regretted my transition and that it was starting to cause me emotional and also physical harm. My parents actually had pushed back on me medically transitioning at first, but the team of the medical professionals that helped me to push me really to transition never presented any other options. They said that the rate of regret is less than 1 or 2%, and they even lied to my parents that I would be at risk of suicide were I not allowed to transition. I was 15 years old. It was far too easy for me to go through this. It was only about half a year between being referred to that surgeon and actually going under the knife. During one of the consultations for my surgery, I was told that I would lose my ability to breastfeed, but at this time, this didn't mean anything to me because I didn't know anything about that. I wasn't even thinking about being a parent because I was 15 years old. I had just completed my sophomore year. There was no way that I would have been able to really understand what that meant. I had to eventually drop out of school and go into an alternative program in which I was taking a psychology class. And there was one lesson that was about parenting, maternity, and the development of a child into teenhood. One of the most important parts of the lesson that really stood out to me was breastfeeding and how important physical affection, how that bond is important to the emotional and cognitive development of a child and how they function later in social situations. I mean, before that, I never really thought about being a parent or breastfeeding. It was then that I realized that something beautiful and uniquely female was taken away from me forever. And I was perfectly healthy before that. I was only a kid. I don't think the biggest problem with my transition was that I regretted it. What's more damaging was that they lied to me and my parents. They coerced my parents into allowing me to do this. They withheld a lot of information from us. But even then, at the age I was, I just wasn't capable of giving informed consent. And it's seriously affected both my mental and physical health. I'm still recovering to this day. I don't know if I'll be able to conceive a child or safely carry to term, and I certainly won't be able to breastfeed.
And the parents are in such a state of distress, and I would describe it as coercion when somebody says your child might die and you would contribute to their suicide. I'm not sure that the parent is able to make an informed decision at that point, because the dichotomy of decisions that they're being faced with clearly have one decision that is available, and there's grave fear, which we've already talked about, of consequence. If you say, I don't think this is the right thing for my child, I think that's a scary situation. So I'm not sure how much information, like you said, is actually available to doctors, that they actually know what the consequences of these interventions are. But number two, because of that, they're giving parents such limited information. And so how informed is that consent that parents are making on behalf of their children? I'm not sure. And it's also true even post 18. I know this bill is about kind of minors, but it's true post 18 also. If doctors don't have the information, or nurse practitioners or people online who are dispensing cross-sex hormones, if they don't have all the information, then how are they really informing patients? They have some form that they were given third hand, and they're passing it on and assuming that the person has, number one, the literacy to understand that, and that they're going to go over this in detail and research all of this and ask their own questions. I'm not sure. I think a person who is in grave suffering and has been told that if they don't get this, they might die, I'm not sure that can be quite informed.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there's going to be more to say about informed consent as we go on. So let's keep going and see what progress we can make here.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you very much. I got to say, I was a little nervous for testimony today. I thought you did a great job of talking about an uncomfortable topic. I've sat in rooms many times and talking about this topic, and sadly to say, I feel like I couldn't educate myself or ask questions by fear of just being called out names or something because of me asking the question the wrong way. So I really greatly appreciate you bringing this. I do think it's an important topic, and I thought you did a great job. Are we seeing in the state of Ohio, whether it's child custody cases or child abuse cases, because of chemicals, not because of gender affirmation, pre-chemicals, but chemicals, gender affirmation, whether a parent is strictly holding off of a child and the child is accusing them of abuse because of that, or in child custody cases, the chemical aspect playing into how those decisions are playing out? Are we seeing that in the state of Ohio right now?
Through the chair to Representative Edwards. To an extent, yeah, we're seeing it across the country, and there are some documented cases that are in here. One of those documented cases actually involves a custodial dispute where a mother, and this ties back to the FDIA type of a situation, was pressuring her son to identify as a female. And this was the finding of the court, and not just in my opinion, it was a finding of the court. And there was a custody dispute between, and the father ended up with custody because the mother was pressing that. There was also a case that took place a couple of years ago in Cincinnati where parents actually lost custody of their son because to the grandmother because the son wanted to have the chemicals, the puberty blockers, and the cross-sex hormones, and the judge gave the custody to the grandmother rather than to the parents.
Follow up? Representative Troy.
So this question of custody, because these assumptions about trans kids are real. Any child that presents with any degree of dysphoria must be considered trans and affirmed both socially and medically from the outset, or else you are going to cause their suicide. Then if those claims are all real, then some of this might make sense. But those claims we're finding when you investigate it aren't real. They cannot be backed up. And yet we have important state institutions like CPS, like judges determining custody of children that are relying on those things as though they were real. And we're seeing that bear out in the real world, which I believe your own personal story intersects with.
It's true. What you talked about in the last segment about the information disconnect, the information that we have and how that information is proliferated, what's available to people and how they get it, what is their source of information, I think is complicated. We're not talking about in family court, certainly, we're not talking about juries who are only able to consider the facts that they are presented in front of them. We're talking about a judge in family court and maybe a child representative and maybe attorneys who are certainly influenced by the general popular rhetoric around these things. They're not paid to do investigation on the treatments for gender dysphoria in adolescence. They're not. The only way that kind of information comes out is if you get to the point of a hearing, which is rare. Most things are in family court negotiated, or a judge takes the information that's given. And if you want an expert to testify on some sort of treatment for your child's distress, you have to pay for that. People get paid for their time. That's a thing called work. And so there's no magical way that a judge or child representative or attorneys get information from people without paying them for their time. So even when you have an investigation by a child psychologist that is very likely not an expert in the treatment of gender dysphoria in children, then that's a limited piece of information. In my own particular case, I put a deposit down and paid for Stephen Levine, who testified in Kira Bell's case. He never talked to me. That was not the issue in this particular case. I was trying to get a provision in my parenting agreement that said no medicalization of the concept of gender, meaning no puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, basically. And there's a whole paragraph of that. And like I had discussed in the other segment, my ex-husband had said, she's not interested in this. I said, okay, so we should put it in. And that was a back and forth. But the person who was going to testify at my hearing was Stephen Levine. And I paid him to go through the entire report from the child psychologist, which had interviews, hours of interviews from me, my ex-husband, various people, including my daughter. And he was going to testify just so I could get that provision to say that there shouldn't be any sort of medicalization of my child. And that's thousands of dollars. That's thousands of dollars that actually we never went to a hearing. My ex-husband agreed to that provision. But of course, I still had to pay him because that's the preparation that's required. The hearing itself, he probably only talks for 20 minutes, so maybe 30 max. But we're not even talking about that much of his time, which probably would have been via Zoom at that point because we were under COVID restrictions. But the time is the preparation. The time is looking over everything. And it really does cost money. So the idea that somehow experts are giving information to judges and all of the other people involved in court cases, and that information is the best available in the entire world. There's no way. There's no way. That's not at all what happens. This is not Law and Order. This is not some other crime show. This is individual judges making the best decisions given the information that they have. And some people have sat on the bench for 20 years and they're grandparents and they have a lot of, let's say, parenting experience in their own life. And they've seen thousands and thousands of children come through. And there are others who just don't have that experience. And it is completely subjective arena. So I can understand the two scenarios that he described where judges independently stated, hey, I don't think this is the right move for this child, and I think they would be better suited in a house that does not want to medicalize the concept of gender, yeah, I can understand how judges come to that conclusion. I can also understand how they could come to the opposite conclusion.
I
It's
think he gives
subjective.
like one story on both sides of that issue.
Yeah.
If I recall, one of them is where the judge put him with the parent who was not going to medicalize him, and the other one was that both the parents didn't want to medicalize him, but the grandma was apparently okay with it, so they put him in that position. And so it's interesting that's
Yeah,
happening on both sides of that question.
this is the subjectivity, because what's happening in family court in particular is there's a difference between the child going to another family member and the child going to the state.
Mm.
So we know, for instance, if a child goes to the state, I'm not aware of states that don't have this provision. My understanding, at least my limited knowledge, is that when children are in foster care, foster parents are required to affirm and proceed with any sort of psychological or medical intervention that is, quote, necessary. And in the current state, foster parents are required to go through with these things for children that are not theirs. That's a scary prospect to me, that children that are held by the state for hopefully a limited period of time until their parents can grow and be ready to parent again, that the state is intervening in this particular way. I have a serious problem with that. In my particular situation, as well as the one that you were referring to, where the parents were not affirming and then the child went to the grandmother, that child then goes to another family member, and the family member then has that medical decision making. And in my case, it was that. There's a better option, not the best option, better. It's a better option in the eyes of the state. And it should be temporary, and it should be reevaluated periodically. I think that's the thing that we miss, is that we're not evaluating the best scenario for this child. I think when kids are in foster care, it's a constant reevaluation of the state saying, okay, this child is in foster care. We need to take a look. What's going on with the parents? Are they doing the interventions? Are they doing the things that are required of them in order to return the child to what should be the natural kind of state where the children are with their biological parents? I think that's the goal in general of everything, is that everybody is in that. No state wants to be in the business of running orphanages for every kid who is distressed. So I think that's a serious problem in the arena of children who then go to another family member, such as my ex-husband, such as a grandparent, such as anybody else. There's no provision for reevaluation in the same way that there is with children in foster care. That's how it has been nearly 4 years since I have had any custody of my child. There's no provision for reevaluation of the situation.
That's got to be heartbreaking. It's so difficult to hear about stories like that.
There really should be something, because we're talking about the child. I'm an adult, I can cope with these things, but the child is missing a connection in the same way that a foster child who is in the foster care system is missing a connection with one or both of their biological parents. It's the same. It's not like any single parent or any single grandparent or aunt or uncle or guardian can take the place of that role that the biological mother and father have. It's not possible to make up for that. And so the goal should always be reunification with both parents if possible. And I'm not sure why family court doesn't have that, particularly in this case, where it's something that actually could be resolved and would normally fall in the same way for foster children or children in the foster care system.
That theme of people being afraid to dissent, afraid to criticize, afraid to do anything other than the affirmation only model can extend to judges as well. Because here in Texas, anyway, judges go up for election, and stories of bad rulings can find their way into election rhetoric and campaign issues. And if the social gestalt is that any judge who doesn't rule in favor of affirmation may be subject to smears on the campaign, we're all human. That may shape the way that they approach, especially if they can just say, the medical experts think this is the right thing, so I'm just going to defer all my judgment to those experts and rule in a way that would support what the experts say. It's a nice, easy way to get yourself out of a difficult spot. And it's the people who say, hold on a second, let's look at this, that risk things. Okay, let's keep going.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Click. You've indicated that you're carrying this bill at the request of a doctor and a lot of parents.
Yes, sir.
I have heard from a lot of parents in my district who are opposed to this measure. I think as Representative Edwards said, this is a very sensitive, it's a very heart-wrenching situation and all that. And kind of a problem I pause and ponder sometimes when the General Assembly decides that we're going to take one side of this issue or the other, whether that's in areas like abortion, whether that's in areas like this. And you indicated that I do see in the bill that it will criminalize by anyone who engages in this practice. It definitely, we're taking sides and we're also criminalizing something that I don't think we have really all of the information on at this point. Your comments on that?
Through the chair to Representative Troy, it's always a joy to serve with you, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your kindness all the way through the halls of the House here. And I understand that you're getting some emails. I'm getting emails both ways on this as well, and Facebook comments and Twitter, and I'm sure that's all going on right now during the testimony. But there are certain things, so sometimes it is, I'm like you, I believe in less regulation. But there are some times when the life and the well-being of a child is at stake. And what we're talking about here is children who will be forever sterile, will not be able to have children who are going to have double mastectomies, penectomies, penile inversions, things like that, that will affect them for the rest of their lives as children. And they can't go and recoup that. They cannot go get that back. And in fact, one of the interesting things, how some of these trans-identified people get stuck, is when insurance companies do cover it, it's a one-way trip. They will cover your transition, but the moment you say, you know what, that was wrong for me, I want to go back, they say, oh, that's cosmetic. And that certainly is inappropriate. So I think there are certain times, and as I already documented here, the suicide rate is 20 times higher for those who transition. So because we care about kids and we want to save lives, I think it is appropriate for us to intervene.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right.
So what was his original question?
His question was, we're taking a major step, and it seems like this bill, if we pass it, is taking a really strong stance on one side, not just a stance of maybe someone would lose their licensure, but it's criminalizing something. And so on what basis do we make that strong of an argument here? I think his answer doesn't address that head on, other than to point out that the consequences, the stakes are really high. This is not just like it's not like whether or not minors can get tattoos, which might be regrettable, but aren't going to totally shut off major parts of your life that are part of the normal human experience. Are not going to preclude you from having a family, not going to preclude you from nursing a child, which are the stakes at play here on this particular issue. And that's why it's important to come down pretty strongly on one way or the other.
But my understanding was the penalties, and unless the draft changed from what I recall of House Bill 454, is that the penalty is a kind of a misconduct toward the licensing board. I can understand how that becomes then an investigation, a possible loss of license for a doctor or therapist or somebody else who's participating in these interventions. I'm not missing the part where people go to jail or something.
Well,
I don't
know that-
recall that in the bill. So unless I'm missing the definition of criminal.
I think it's true that sometimes things can be misinterpreted and then brought into a question like this. There was some language that we will learn in subsequent hearings gets softened. And so Click is responding to his critics by working with people to change the language of the bill, address some of these concerns. And I think it's good that we're having some pushback on even if we agree with the state intervening, then there's different proportionality of what type of intervention is necessary. And if you come down on criminalization, then it may be that will make it even less likely for any bill to be passed because people are less hesitant to intervene with the medical profession such that they criminalize certain things.
Because they're adding regulation, and that's the thing. I think it's a tough sell, even if you believe that this is a completely right-wing driven idea from the Republican Party. Then why would they be in the business of adding more regulation where we're then prosecuting people, parents, professionals for their activities, that doesn't make sense. Clearly, that argument doesn't work if you're critical of these bills. And I can understand how Click immediately said, hey, I'm not for more regulation, but I don't think what's happening is right. And I think there's a role, like I said, for government in this process.
Yeah. And that may be, in some sense, an allusion to the way that other states have handled things that has not gone well. I think in Texas here, we had Governor Abbott I don't know if it was like head of CPS or one of the people say, well, we're going to define these transition interventions as child abuse. And we're going to empower citizens then to report anyone that they know is involved in child abuse to state agencies for investigation and potential criminal charges of child abuse. And so that then immediately turned any clinician who was involved into this in potentially being classified as a child abuser. And so that type of criminality, people on one side of this argument may say, yeah, that's how we want to do it. We want to get it. We want to stop them. But if you're doing it in a way that kind of is a more authoritarian way and not something that is an interplay between the duties and responsibilities of the medical profession and the safeguarding roles of the government, and instead is just a big blunt hammer, then you may be actually shooting yourself in the foot, because you're going to have government overstep its bounds, have legitimate pushback on that degree of overstep, and then you're going to remove the ability to do any degree of oversight on that particular issue because you've poisoned it by going too far.
Yeah, I can understand how people could say that it's going too far, and that was an attorney general memo on that, and then a follow-up with the Child Protective Services realm in Texas. But for anybody to say that sterilizing children for a psychological condition is not child abuse, that the person needs their own psychological help. Sterilizing children is child abuse. So I'm not sure how anybody could think differently. Now, the same way that we have scared therapists into practicing actual real therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, by calling any discussion that they have with children who are possibly questioning why their body is changing and how much they hate it, that somehow those therapists could lose their license and also face some sort of penalty is the other side of that same coin. So I'm not sure how the Texas Attorney General's statement is any different than that, because the therapists are in threat of losing their license for practicing conversion therapy, just as parents who are transing their children by taking them to practitioners who shouldn't actually be administering these treatments on children because they don't have an evidence base for it, and teachers who are making the entire classroom go along with wrong sex pronouns for a child when a child is in second, third, fourth grade, and they are psychologically making everybody participate in that farce. I think there's something wrong about that. And I can understand how that is harm. That's real harm. To call it abuse or neglect, I think, of course, there's provisions for that. There's actual lists of ways that you are psychologically or physically harming children. I don't think that every child who gets their hair cut, that their parent puts them in different clothes because they want them. I'm not sure that an investigation by CPS would call that parent abusive if all of a sudden they want to call their kid Max instead of Mary. I'm not sure that CPS investigation would yield a child abuse allegation. But to say that clinicians who are injecting children with cross-sex hormones until they are sterile is not child abuse, I think somebody is clearly out of line if they think that is not abuse of children. I can understand how they're using the normal power of the state. They're not actually creating anything new. There's no new government regulation that they are instituting in Texas. They're simply using the current statute to say that if you are doing these interventions, it is psychologically and physically damaging to children. That is abuse. That has always been true. There's nothing new there.
That brings to point something that Click does in this response, which is he gets rid of pleasant euphemistic language. Because when you talk to gender therapists and people on the affirmation side, they'll use pleasant sounding words like top surgery, bottom surgery, and it just sounds so clean.
Or
And it sounds like,
affirmation.
yeah.
Affirmation. So positive.
And it sounds like little checkbox in somewhere, and it's fine. But when you identify it for what it is, double mastectomy on a teenage girl, penectomy, literally surgically removing the penis of a teenage boy, sterilization, removing the ability of these kids to subsequently form families. He doesn't go into it, but also the complete absence of the full measure of sexual experience, where with the whole inability to have an orgasm for your entire life. All of these things are decisions and consequences that no child can weigh because they are not in a position in their life where they understand any of the context, any of their future desires or motivations to have. And when you cut through the jargon and call things what they are, then it brings clarity to a situation that should also give you a sense of what the stakes are and why it's important that because these things are happening, the state has a role to play in finding some way to draw boundaries around it. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah, and you cited podcasts, you cited citations and things like that. We can go on the internet, basically verify, affirm our position, regardless of what it is.
He makes that point, I think, to try to undermine what Click is doing, but it's the other point that's also true, is that whole idea that you could just be looking for things that support your position and ignoring any contrary evidence is also how you would get yourself into the point where you're doing things that aren't backed by evidence.
There any behavioral health associations, medical associations that have basically indicated support of this particular measure?
100 through the chair, almost missed it. Through the chair to the representative. Absolutely, the American College of Pediatricians supports this bill.
One final question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I think at the time that this conversation was happening, when you looked for professional organizations that you could get on board, it may be that the American College of Pediatricians that he referenced there is the only one that has made a statement on that. Since that time, there are other organizations of professionals that could be added to that. We've already talked about the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. We're seeing GenSpect. We're seeing GenSpect's more of a advocacy group. There are a couple other organizations of professionals.
WPATH has switched they are revising their guidelines. They continue to discuss this, and we see former leaders of all kinds of associations speaking out. I think, though, what this statement is, and you'll see this run throughout all the hearings in every state, not just this state, is associations are infallible. They know what's best, and we should just follow whatever all the associations are saying. And they only have a couple that they're referring to. So the pediatricians, they're referring to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and then the American Psychological Association. So they're hanging their hat on a couple of associations, and then the World Professional Association of Trans Health. And I'm not sure, of course, WPATH has a stake in this, has a stake in the concept of transgender. Of course they do. I don't see the term gender dysphoria inside of their own name, for example, or the idea that gender dysphoria could in fact be resolved and probably should be resolved psychologically, because that's what we're talking about as a psychological condition. So I'm not even sure how we're having medical associations weigh in on something that everybody agrees is psychological distress.
That's a good point. So in the future, if this bill comes up again and this question comes up again, then in addition to the American College of Pediatrics, they can bring up the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. The Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine is another organization of both physicians and mental health professionals for that. And hopefully we will see support for these organizations and additional organizations that are brought up to present a professional face with a different perspective, a different approach to the evidence base of this than what we're seeing with what is starting with WPATH and then just being adopted wholesale by other organizations that want to have some say in this that you mentioned. All right.
In the bill, it says it prohibits healthcare professionals from providing gender transition procedures to minors and from referring minors to a medical doctor for those procedures. Basically, medical doctors have taken an oath to do no harm. Why would we prohibit at least a referral to these medical doctors to then be able to make that decision? I don't think they would make that decision, take that decision lightly and would understand the risks and everything involved. I guess the question is, we're prohibiting a lot of activity here that maybe will end up with the same result that you desire, is that they're not going to recommend this particular procedure to take place.
Through the chair to the representative, I understand your concerns. I think we're covering all of our bases is the idea in doing that. They can refer, so referrals also include referring someone from Ohio to Kentucky or to Indiana or to Michigan or to Ohio. And we are trying to prevent this. The American College of Pediatrics actually calls this child abuse. And we are trying to prevent that type of abuse of children that is going to jeopardize their lives by every means possible here in the state of Ohio.
Are there any additional questions for this sponsor?
He asked the question about physicians, MDs, have taken an oath to do no harm, so why don't we just let that oath constrain them? And so we shouldn't have any problem with just saying we can't refer out. And the oath to do no harm being a historical aspect of the medical profession, it's not about the fact that you've raised your hand and taken an oath. It's about the ethical considerations behind that oath when you are interacting with vulnerable people about their healthcare. And mental health professionals are also driven by the same ethical principles. So the idea of first do no harm isn't something that is, well, you have an MD behind your name, then you have to do first do no harm, but everybody else can just approach their interventions in the lives of people without having to consider that ethical question. That is not the case. These ethical principles exist in the realm of professionals interacting with people's lives, whether it's mental health or physical and surgical changes. That is the first thing that popped into my head on that exchange.
I think what pops into my head is we don't actually know any data. So if you're referring a child who is in distress that you cannot seem to resolve, or that you think that medical professionals are going to help this child with their psychological distress, then you're going to refer them to medical professionals who don't have enough data in order to understand that the intervention that they're performing is actually helping. There's no circle back on that. There's an entire kind of procedure that they're following without any loop back as to whether or not it actually helps people or harms them. So the idea that you have that first do no harm, I'm not sure that there's enough data for the medical professional to know whether they are actually harming someone. I think long-term data is a bit challenging there because we see young people who feel like they have what is necessary and they have hope for the next step and the next step and the next step. So first they get their hair cut, then they get some new clothes, they change their name at school. All of these are processes along the stages of continuing to have hope for something in the future, that once I do this, I'll be happy. Once I do this, I'll be happy. And we know, just generally speaking in society, people who have that idea that once I have done this, I'm going to be happy, that's not a sustainable way of living. You basically can never check all of those boxes. It's an infinite number of check boxes, and you never get to a state of happiness. That's a psychological kind of training that you can do through CBT. I can understand how doctors might think that they are helping, but they actually don't have the information that would demonstrate to them the harms that detransitioners describe quite thoroughly. And that data is, of course, we see coming out in detransitioners, and we're playing a bit of catch up, but we have a lot of children who actually have been harmed. So I can't say that medical professionals shouldn't be consulted for a host of actual real physical problems. That's the other part of this, to say that you cannot refer a child from psychological something over to a medical professional. There could be some danger in that. When is it okay to refer? When is it not? We have lots of children, for example, of parents in my group who have Lyme disease, other real physical ailments, disabilities, all kinds of things. And I would hate to have a provision that you cannot refer somebody for medical treatment. Now, medical treatment around gender, that's a problem. They should get medical treatment for the actual physical problems that they have, not for the fact that they don't like their breasts.
Yeah. And that's where I think making sure that the language in the bill is able to not disrupt the normal referral pattern that would happen for some other underlying conditions and treat them. And that's a really challenging thing to navigate. Because if you just take out any provision that does anything about any referrals, then you do allow them complete freedom to get those underlying issue referrals, but then you haven't done anything to prevent what I think is happening. So if you watch the Florida hearings, which I've published on my channel, and you watch the Swedish documentary, you start to get the sense that there is a black hole of accountability in between the three main pillars here. You've got the mental health professionals, which are seeing them at intake, evaluating the gender dysphoria, and guiding them on their pathway of affirmation. You've got the endocrinologists who administer the hormone blockers and the cross-sex hormones, and you've got the surgeons who do the double mastectomies, the penectomies, the penile inversions, okay? So they'll come in here, and the mental health professional will do affirmation, let's get you on the cross-sex hormones. So then, but the mental health professional does not do the hormones, so they refer you to the endocrinologist. Now, in some cases, the endocrinologist and the mental health professional, they're in the same clinic. And so that's fine. And that mental health professional is probably not going to be a psychiatrist. It will probably be a social worker or, yeah. And so they are then, but they can say, okay, I'm going to refer you to the endocrinologist. And then the endocrinologist is going to screen you to see if you qualify for puberty blockers. But then when you talk to the but then you go to the endocrinologist and you say, what are your criteria for starting someone on hormone blockers? They'll say, oh, we just assume that if they're referred to us, that the mental health providers have done the screening to make sure that they qualify for it. So if they get referred, we're going to do it. So there's a black hole of accountability there because they're assuming that the endocrinologist is going to apply some criteria for whether or not they get the treatment. But the endocrinologist is assuming that if they've been referred to there, they've already been screened by the mental health professional. And then you've got the surgeon where if they get referred to the surgeon, then this is one of the most interesting exchanges that happens in the Florida hearing where they're talking to one of the psychologists that do the referral and they say, do you recommend surgery on kids that you see? And they'll say, no, we've never recommended surgery. But what she's trying to tease out is they refer patients to surgery, but then they say it's the doctor who should be evaluating the patient and then making the recommendation, the surgeon. So they've absolved themselves of the accountability of that. But then if you go talk to the surgeons will say, they've sent to us from the gender clinic, so we already know that they qualify for it because they're the ones doing the assessment of it.
So I'm confused, Dr. McNamara. You really are an advocate for gender-affirming care. And what I'm hearing from you and other speakers is this is healthy for people. It's healthy for mental health. It's healthy for them in general. So why would you not refer a minor for surgical sex-affirming surgery?
You know, I also appreciate this question because it lends insight into the shared decision-making process. I've never referred a patient for surgery because the patient has never desired surgery who I've cared for. It's all about what the patients want, how that fits into the informed consent model, and how that is, and how that goes along with clinical practice guidelines.
So, well, I'm sorry. So what age group are you seeing? I think up to 25 or something?
10 to 25.
Yeah, so no age has any of your patients desired to have surgery for their mastectomy, a phalloplasty, a phallosectomy, none of that.
None of my patients have desired that surgery at that moment in time. We discuss openly.
Okay, so again, if gender-affirming care is what's proper, why have you not recommended that surgery?
I think what I'm trying to say is that I haven't recommended that surgery. I haven't helped facilitate it because none of my patients have expressed a desire for it. That's my
right. But I'm an oncologist. Patients don't come to me requesting desire for chemotherapy, but I recommend chemotherapy because that's what's best for them. So as a physician, if you think that gender-affirming care is best for your patients, why have you not recommended surgery on any of your patients?
Gender-affirming care does not equal surgery.
I understand. There's a continuum.
That behavior is inappropriate, please.
We need to have some quorum here, so we'll appreciate if you do not do those actions at this point in time. Let's have an intelligent and cohesive conversation, please.
So, Dr. McNamara, I understand there's a continuum of puberty blockers, sexual sex hormones to change the sex, and surgery. And what we've heard from all the other experts is that there's this whole continuum is part of gender-affirming health care. So do you think that the surgery is part of gender-affirming health care or not?
I do think it's part of gender-affirming healthcare for some individuals.
Okay, so, but you don't recommend it to anybody, is what you just said. You missed it.
That is not an appropriate characterization of what I said. I have not had a patient who has expressed a desire for it in my experience.
Again, they may not express a desire, but you as a physician make recommendations to patients based on what you think is best for their overall care. So you have never made the recommendation. Just want to get that on the record. Did you hear me?
Yeah, I have. I can hear you.
Yeah. So are you going to answer my question or just not?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you ask another question? I promise I hear about 50% of what you say.
My question was, have you ever, as a physician, we recommend treatment to patients based on our judgment of what's best for their care. So you have never, and so in the continuum of gender-affirming healthcare, surgery is part of that. Have you?
Yeah.
And you just said, and so I'm asking you, have you ever recommended surgery to your patients?
I don't tell anybody you need surgery. You should get surgery.
Okay.
That's not how gender-affirming care works. Physicians don't tell patients what they should do with their bodies or their gender expression.
I understand. As an oncologist, I don't tell them I give my recommendation as to what they need. So you're, again, just answer the question yes or no. Have you ever recommended surgery for your patients?
I have. I wonder if maybe we're disagreeing on the definition of recommendation.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. McNamara. I have one question. Just one question that I'll have some board member. My only question is that if tomorrow a patient comes to your office and that person says he or she believes that they need a top or bottom surgery, would you recommend the surgery? The patient really wants a surgery done. He or she believes that they must have the surgery done. Would you recommend the surgery? Yes or no?
At what stage in this patient's care are we in?
What's that?
At what stages are we at in this patient care?
The patients that you see for genital dystonia, if the patient comes to you and the patient believes that he or she needs a surgery, would you recommend surgery? Please answer yes or no.
Well, I can't do that. How old is this patient?
Let's say 17.
17. Okay. And how long has this patient been in my care for?
Well, I didn't talk to the patient. Let's assume the patient had it for several years, and now the patient believes that he or she must have the surgery.
Must have the surgery.
Yes.
What kind of surgery are we talking about specifically?
Either the top or the bottom surgery.
Either surgery. Okay. So if a patient came to me after they had been in my care for several years and they expressed a strong desire for a gender-affirming surgery and they were 17, the WPATH guidelines state that this patient should be referred for an informed consent discussion with a qualified surgeon who can discuss the risks and the benefits of that surgery with them. I would facilitate that referral and refer that person to an expert in the surgery that they desire.
So you would recommend the surgery?
I would allow the surgeon to discuss the options, the risks and the benefits, because that is not my specific area of expertise as somebody who does not practice any surgery.
Well, thank you, Dr. Madden.
And that, I think, is why in some instances they've tried to make these teams involve endocrinologists and surgeon and mental health professionals all on the same team. So there's not that black hole of accountability. But then if the entire team is driven by this mantra of affirmation only, then they're never going to put the brakes on it anyway. But that black hole of accountability comes clear in the Swedish documentaries where the journalist is saying, okay, if this goes wrong in a patient, who has the responsibility? And he talks to the clinic, he talks to the surgeons, and everybody's pointing at everybody else. They're the ones that do it. And then they finally say, and then they point at the patient. This kid also was involved, and his parents were also involved, even though they acknowledge that the patients are under mental duress. They're depressed, they're anxious, they've got psychological comorbidities.
If all the parents, us medical professionals, and the young person themselves all see it that way, to help her not have to deal with that bust. Can a 14-year-old really understand the consequences of such a decision? If it is a very young person, then we make a particularly careful assessment. But you're quite right that there is a dual ethical problem. The unethicalness of not helping to ease their suffering, and also there's the unethicalness in that the patient may change their mind 15 years down the line. And whose responsibility is it if that happens? Well, since these decisions are based on consensus between the child, the parents, and the professionals, then it is a shared responsibility. Shared responsibility? They're placing part of the responsibility on a child with psychiatric problems. Looking back now, I think it's actually completely sick how this process plays out. Because there's so little support for all this. At the heart of it, the healthcare system is the one responsible. They're supposed to provide a correct diagnosis.
And so you have a system that is broke in a way where people are avoiding accountability, they're displacing accountability, and in the meantime, things just go, the train is already greased, the rails are greased, it's going to go in that direction, unless somebody says, hold on, let's put on the brakes. But that statement of hold on, let's put on the brakes is what is socially, professionally frowned upon, and people risk their livelihoods, their standing in the medical community by saying, let's put on the brakes. And that's where in these other places, government investigations, full reviews of all the evidence have allowed from a top-down approach for them to say, hold on, we need to reevaluate, reconsider what we're doing. But that's only after so many patients' lives, so many families' lives have been really affected by what is going on that they've tried to get those government agencies to look into this. And that's what we're seeing happen here in Ohio.
I think this black hole of accountability phrase is excellent.
The other thing that he brings up is that even in our system as it exists today, where some insurance plans will cover the surgery for transition, it is a real indication of the one-sidedness of this, of the fact that there's a gap in care, if you even allow this to happen, where if somebody has had their transition paid for, but then they come to terms with it not being the right choice for them, and they want to do something to transition back, or have some measure of care for transitioning back. The most frequent thing that people will encounter will be young teenage girls who get double mastectomies, who, after detransitioning, want to claim that feminine aspect of their presentation and will want breast reconstructive surgery on their chest. Well, that's no longer covered. That's considered now a cosmetic procedure. And I know there's some people that have said, even if we can't outlaw these procedures from being done, but we can classify them in the transition realm as also cosmetic procedures. But because it's been attached to this dysphoria diagnosis as a disease, then they can consider it to be a therapy for the disease. Whereas if your dysphoria resolves and you've detransitioned, I don't even think you can say that, because when you talk to detransitioners, they now have a gender dysphoria where they have distress about their body, not because they're born in the wrong body, but because their body is now deformed by the surgeries, and they just want to have something that is closer to their own natal sex for it. So it's a dysphoria, but from the other side. And I don't know, because we're going to have to, in the coming years, deal with the reality of the interventions that have been done on these patients. And it may be that we need a new type of diagnosis of gender dysphoria that is the dysphoria over the surgical interventions that have happened, that then can capture some degree of insurance to try to help these patients. I don't know what the right way forward for this, but this is a big question mark that is also an embarrassing void in the healthcare world of the guidelines for this. And if you look at the WPATH's Standard of Care 8 guidelines, which just came out in the past year, they do not address in any helpful way or in any realistic way the phenomenon of detransitioners and the significant challenges that they will have dealing with the consequences of all of these interventions.
Isn't it interesting that we're probably going to create a new diagnosis code for people that we have harmed through gender medicine? We've actually created some sort of distress through intervention, which, yes, I can see. Even just this past 24 hours, we have 2 detransitioners that we're talking to try to find them a physician who will help them with the very real issues that they're having because of the cross-sex hormones and the surgeries that they have had. It's very complicated because, again, there's not much information out there, and they're trying to deal with situations that they don't know what's going to happen. And so those doctors are being put in a position of actually performing experimental medicine because people have already been experimented on in the first place by being subjected to these experimental treatments. And now doctors who wish to try to help them are participating in the next step of experimentation because they don't have the data on the first step of experimentation, which is really complicated. I think one thing that you do mention, and have to make sure that this is so important when we talk about data, you referred to insurance and the role of insurance in the United States in particular on how things are happening and whether or not things are covered. And we know that when we cover things, they are more likely to happen. That's just very clear data. When you pay for things, when the government pays for things, or when private insurance pays for things, people do it more. That's clear. So when we remove some of these things from being paid for, guess what? They are less likely to happen. But to say that we don't somehow have data, we actually do. Our government system doesn't have socialized medical care where the government is taking it, but our insurance companies do. Our insurance companies have all of this. They know all of these procedures. They know how many 14-year-old girls are getting testosterone. All of that is there. It just takes somebody to actually pay for it. So instead of the government saying, hey, I want this data from the government, they should actually get it through insurance companies. But guess what? You have to pay for that because those are private. There's no magical kind of data set that you're not going to have to pay for. And even if you paid for it, even if you got it through the Medicaid system, you're talking about people of a certain socioeconomic kind of background. The other part is the government actually has one piece of data that they're not utilizing in every single state. And you referred to pharmaceutical kind of mistakes that we've made, particularly with opioids. But every state has a prescription drug monitoring program now, thanks to the opioid crisis. Every single state tracks scheduled drugs in their prescriptions by government mandate now. They know, every state knows how many children are getting prescriptions for testosterone because it's a Schedule III steroid. And every single government official should be asking for that data from their state because we actually have that.
Well, hopefully that bit of information will be part of the discussion in the SAFES Act return to committee in the coming years. Yeah, we should probably move on to his next segment. Let's see, we're getting close.
Sponsor, Representative Liston.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I have many, but I have to pause and make sure that we correct some misinformation. American College of Pediatricians is a socially conservative advocacy group of 1 to 200 pediatricians. as opposed to the American Association of Pediatrics, the AAP, which is the professional organization of tens of thousands of pediatricians for whom gender-affirming care is the standard of care, highly individualized supportive care, including psychiatric services, and ultimately transitions care as needed for transgender individuals with appropriate assessment, as well as the fact that puberty blockers do not lead to permanent lifelong sterilization. And I feel like we have to start with at least what the main.
Okay, I just want to make sure we don't lose her last statement. So she first points out that the American College of Pediatrics is a small organization, and she claims that it is a political organization.
Yeah, that's incorrect. It's a group of pediatricians who are coming together because they're seeing that they are not represented by the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Yeah. And then she mentions that the American Pediatrics, I love this hand motion, the American Pediatrics was tens of thousands of members. And that's where it's really helpful to go in and say, okay, they have guidelines, they have standard practice, and then connect the dots. They adopted it from WPATH. So it's really just a reproduction of WPATH's guidelines. And then the idea that all tens of thousands of members investigated this issue, looked at the strength of the data, and then came out in support of it is a shell game. That is not what happened. And in fact, if there were outspoken physicians who raised dissenting voices in this, they were marginalized. They were not invited to talk. They were not given a platform to give a different perspective on this. And so it's like you shut down one side of the debate. Those people say, okay, we're going to go off, have a forum where we can't discuss things. And then you say that forum it's just a bunch of nut jobs. It's just very small. They're all politically motivated. They have bad opinions on some issues, so we have to not listen to them on all issues. It's a political game, but it's like the only game that those physicians can play because otherwise they have no platform upon which to get their voice heard. And the president of that organization is Quentin Van Meter. He testified in a couple of these state hearings. And when you listen to his story, it's really compelling. And the arguments that he brings to bear are not rooted in scripture, rooted in Bible, rooted in some weird political faction. It's rooted in the evidence and in a legitimate concern for children from the perspective of a pediatrician who is examining the evidence and very interested in helping kids.
What's complicated is any kind of association group of people, nobody wants to say that the vast majority of them are actually not participating in the guidelines process, but that's true. The vast majority of them are required by their hospitals to be part of an association, just like many teachers are required to be part of a union. People are required to be part of an association, a professional association. To say that they are active participants, I think is false. So like you're referring to the idea that somehow all of these pediatricians, did they consent to these guidelines necessarily? They probably assented. Yeah, I don't have a problem. I don't have time. It's fine. I don't seem to see a big problem because they are involved in their own practice of medicine or therapy or education. They don't have time necessarily to participate in the political games that gets to the point of publishing guidelines that are pages and hours of meetings and all of this stuff because they're practicing. They're doing their actual jobs with real patients. And those are the things that take up the hours of their day. And they have families and they have all other kinds of commitments. So it is the people with free time and some with political motivations.
So this is going to come up, and I want to make sure that we have a segment here where we specifically address each of the institutions that get invoked. So she just invoked the American Academy of Pediatrics. And this is where you really need to say, before you just simply say, oh, the American Academy of Pediatrics, 10,000 members, we have to listen to what they say. We make sure you also listen to people who have examined their exact statement, dug into the references that they used to justify their policy on their position for treating transgender kids, and then look to see if the arguments made, the interpretation and analysis of the data, and the citations themselves are strong or weak or legitimate. And this is where you can look at an article published by James Cantor, who, when this policy came out, he went and looked at each of the claims line by line and demonstrated how their policy positions were based on bad evidence, on poor studies, on low quality, that their own analysis and discussion misrepresented what the data itself said. If you read it and dig into his citations as well, you'll come out of that process with the clear understanding that there was clearly an ideological component to what the American Academy of Pediatrics did, and that there is no way that all 10,000 members were able to dig into that. When you're a member, you're a working pediatrician, as you said, you're a member of the academy of your profession, you're trusting that the people at the head of that academy, that on the committees that publish things like guidelines, are doing full review and analysis of the data. They're weighing all of the data, all of the major significant studies, and then making professional recommendations. That is what they've been able to trust them to do on issues like children's diabetes, all other major issues. But on this one, because of that ideological component, it appears, and I would say it's justified for some pediatricians to say they were betrayed by this organization for allowing such an ideologically driven, unscientific, non-evidence-based policy to make its way into the pantheon of policies and guidelines endorsed by that organization. And hopefully we're seeing more people willing to wake up and talk about this. But because Representative Liston cites this again and again, you just have to understand that she's citing this, but has she gone through and looked at the criticisms of that policy? Has she looked at the strength of the evidence of that policy? Because she may, in good faith, be just doing what a lot of pediatricians do. They are professionals, they are scientists, health professionals, so they're not going to endorse policies that they haven't really dug into. So I'm just going to trust them. If they've endorsed it, they have the strength of 10,000 physicians, then who am I to dissent? Who are you to dissent, testifier, whether it's Representative Click or these other people? You're just one voice in the wilderness. We've got 10,000 voices here. It's like a Potemkin village where it has all of the appearance far away of something that is substantial. But when you get close and you really look into it, it's a hollow shell of what it should be. And because it has affected so many kids' lives, that's something that really needs to be dug into. It's based on poor evidence and it is poorly argued. And this is not just like, I'm calling it poor evidence because I looked at a study and I say, well, that's a lame study and it's just my opinion. There are standards for the strength of data that you are required to qualify any point of evidence on it. And when you look at these standards of care, they label them as low evidence quality, yet they still make the recommendation. And that's where you can tell there's an ideological component of that. And that discussion comes out in subsequent testimony here.
So I want to take a note that you said that once you get close to the village, you can see things a little bit differently. I will say that I literally got close to the village at Anaheim, California in the fall. We and a number of parents and organizations, Partners for Ethical Care, went to Anaheim to the conference of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we stood on the street and talked to pediatricians as they walked by. I can tell you that all of the people in the village do not agree with what's going on because we talk to them personally one-on-one. They're not in agreement. And they're very much, so many of them passed by and said thank you because we were holding up signs that said, listen to detransitioners and no child is born in the wrong body. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has made the wrong decision here. And all kinds of things that we were communicating silently with signs. If they engaged with us, we would talk to them. And it was just silently holding up signs. And we got tons of acknowledgement. And we could see, obviously, they're going to this convention. It's on the same block that we were standing on silently with our signs. And it was quite heartening to hear, and they felt quite good. Some of them stopped at length to talk to us, particularly in the afternoon, just saying, I just hate what's going on. But frankly, I'm scared to say anything. I don't have time inside my own practice. This is what I do. And I'm sure this will work itself out. And the only way that things work themselves out is people actually take action. So even the testimony that we're seeing today, it's people taking action. It's people doing something to actually change what's happening. And so I think we did give courage. There were a number of us, and that was hosted by Our Duty in California. And a number of us were out there, including many detransitioners. It was a wonderful experience to be there.
The American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and Exhibition is being held this year in Anaheim, California. With over 10,000 doctors attending, a group took the opportunity to come as well. The group consisted of people from all walks of life who had concern with the affirming gender model doctors are taking. They held the Do Not Harm rally at the convention on Saturday.
I just want the AAP to look at what the current guidelines, take a step back and see what we can actually do to help people, because we are only harming them, because we only give them one option and we don't look at other issues, because I know there's multiple different reasons why someone wants to transition.
Some of those reasons, according to the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, may be comorbid mental health issues and neurodevelopment conditions such as autism or ADHD.
I saw no transgender patients for the first 25 years of my career. And then recently I saw one and then another and another. I realized that every single kid I was sending to the gender clinic was being affirmed and transitioned. They weren't doing any sort of evaluation. And I'm like, I don't think that's good. That tells me that it's not a harmless pause, because 99% of 12-year-olds aren't sure what they're going to be for Halloween. 12-year-olds change their minds all the time.
Many of these kids would just turn out to be gay. Instead, they are lifelong medical patients. They continue to have complications, difficulty finding romantic partners, and they will never have biological children. If the current rate of kids that are being transitioned continues, we're going to have a whole generation of sterile human beings.
Counter-protest groups dressed in full black garb disrupted the rally by chanting and blocking cameras with signs.
I do encourage other people to do this silent signage where you just give courage to other people that they're not alone in their thoughts. So yes, I got close to the village. I can tell you that, I'm sorry, they do not all agree with the policies from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
So I want to take a second here, because as I think about this, one of the ideas is Representative Liston cites this 10,000 member American Academy of Pediatrics, and she brings that up multiple times. It's almost though she assumes that there was a vote that was held by all 10,000 members, and the overwhelming majority agreed with it. Now, if you say it was a democratic process and if 51% agreed with it, then it passed, that should be still subject to a debate. But so let's see. In 2018, the American Academy of Pediatrics published a policy statement entitled Ensuring Comprehensive Care and Support for Transgender and Gender Diverse Children and Adolescents. The paper was primarily authored by Dr. Jason Rafferty, a recent graduate of Brown University's Triple Board Residency for Pediatrics, Psychiatry, and Child and Adolescent Psychiatry.
The paper you're talking about is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, Ensuring Comprehensive Care and Support for Transgender and Gender Diverse Children and Adolescents. What prompted the Academy to issue this policy paper now?
So it was, we were looking at every 5 years or so, the Academy looks at the papers that we have and the positions that we have. And for a long time, there was a paper on basically looking at the health needs of all LGBTQ youth. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and that's a very large umbrella. And it includes really sort of a wide range of health needs. And what we found in the previous positions were that it didn't get at some of these specific questions that we're talking about now that kids who are gender diverse face, and the ways that primary care, pediatricians could really become involved in the process of supporting these kids, what they could do, ways they could counsel families and educate families. And so out of that, we decided that we were going to sort of tease apart a specific paper dealing with these challenges. And that's sort of where it came from. And then also, like I said, sort of the increased social recognition. I think especially over the last, 3 to 5 years, with more people sort of coming out publicly, whether it be celebrities or people in the media, things like that, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of misunderstanding around people who are gender diverse and some of the challenges that they face. So both of those things were sort of coming together at the same time, and the paper was the product.
While committees are listed in addition to Dr. Rafferty, the paper comes with the following statement. Dr. Rafferty conceptualized the statement, drafted the initial manuscript, reviewed and revised the manuscript, approved the final manuscript as submitted, and agrees to be accountable for all aspects of the work.
So you wrote the paper, is that correct?
Yeah.
you had a lot of people who worked with you, or you reviewed a lot of work. Talk about the process coming to this paper, which is 15 pages long, was just recently published.
Yeah. So it was, I was the one who drafted the original draft, and then it goes out through multiple rounds of review through various committees within the American Academy of Pediatrics. So there's a committee on adolescent health, there's a committee on LGBTQ health and things like that. And so, you're really talking about some of the experts in the field who work from various angles with families who have gender diverse youth, really weighing in on some of the, some of the content. And through this process, you end up with a product that's, really been vetted and really sort of stands for, becomes sort of the position of the Academy. It's not my personal position. It really is adapted because of the number of people that really weigh in on it and provide comment. And then it moves on to the, to publication and becomes part of the Academy.
The American Association of Pediatrics, the AAP, which is the professional organization of tens of thousands of pediatricians for whom gender-affirming care is the standard of care.
The paper is now frequently cited as a standard of care, but comes with the following statement. The guidance in this statement does not indicate an exclusive course of treatment or serve as a standard of medical care. The paper recommends a gender-affirmative approach to children with gender dysphoria, but does not provide specific treatment protocols.
Well, the policy itself is focused on this gender-affirming model, and not as much on some of the specifics around, what interventions, do you use hormones, things like that, that's not where we're sort of guiding a lot of primary care pediatricians.
The policy statement refers pediatricians to the treatment protocol guidelines previously published by the Endocrine Society and WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Medical standards of care and guidelines are based on systematic reviews of evidence, with the quality of evidence graded according to the strength of the studies relevant to the recommendations. And the current best practice for rating evidence in systematic reviews is by utilizing the Grading of Recommendations Assessment, Development, and Evaluation, or GRADE approach. This process is essential for publishing clinical recommendations, as the quality or certainty of the evidence is fundamentally important in determining the strength of any subsequent recommendation.
This cartoon shows how we look at our confidence in evidence and the magnitude of effect. It shows two meteorologists. One says to the other, I figure there's a 40% chance of showers and a 10% chance we know what we are talking about. Once again, this very much reflects effects in healthcare. It separates the magnitude of an effect, such as a 40% chance of showers, from the confidence in the evidence behind it, that the meteorologists are about 10% sure that they know what they are talking about.
Standard grade approach ranks evidence on a 4-point scale, from very low to high quality evidence, depending on the character of the studies which produced the evidence.
In the context of making recommendations, it is defined as the quality of evidence reflects the extent to which our confidence in an estimate of the effect is adequate to support a particular recommendation. In the grade approach, recognizing that the quality of evidence comes on a continuum, we do separate the categories high from moderate, from low to very low. As in other grading systems, the randomized controlled trial evidence is judged as high quality. Observational studies start as low quality. This is based on the assumption that randomization is the best method to control for unknown variables that influence effect estimates.
The WPATH standards of care depart from the standard grade approach. They did not publish their evidence grades and instead provided recommendations ranked as weak or strong without providing the quality of the evidence behind the recommendations. Returning to our metaphor, this would be akin to the meteorologist giving a prediction about the weather without telling you how strong the evidence is that led them to that conclusion. This might be acceptable for a weather report, but takes on a whole new level of importance when considering irreversible medical and surgical interventions on vulnerable children. By not publishing the quality grade of the evidence their recommendations were based upon, WPATH denied the public the transparency necessary to understand and assess the judgments made by the authors in formulating their recommendations. This lack of transparency creates a risk of unchecked biases and assumptions overriding what should be an otherwise cautious approach to strong recommendations on therapies for which there is low quality or very low quality evidence. This does not mean that we have no sense of the quality of evidence for gender-affirming therapies, however. In 2017, the Endocrine Society published their own guidelines for medical transition in children with gender dysphoria, co-sponsored by WPATH. These guidelines did follow the grade approach to evidence assessment and ranked the evidence underlying each of their recommendations. Standard grade symbols were used to indicate very low, low, moderate, or high-quality evidence. If you take an overview of the recommendations, you will see that almost all of them are based upon low or very low quality evidence, as depicted in this color-coded diagram. Recommendations shown outlined here are those for which a strong recommendation was made. It should be noted that 2 of the recommendations judged to have very low quality evidence are nonetheless given a strong recommendation. In each instance, the authors have allowed assumed values and preferences to override very low or low quality evidence to ultimately produce strong recommendations. By including the grading of the evidence, they have conceded that the evidence base of the recommendations is weak, leaving their values and preferences transparent and open to inspection and judgment. And it is in those values that critics of the guidelines see an ideological dimension to the gender affirmation model of care. Examples of such criticism include the use of non-scientific jargon such as sex assigned at birth, a notion arising from a social constructivist view of gender. This ideological theme informs other concepts such as gender identity and gender incongruence. An over-reliance on the competency of minors to make irreversible choices about complex surgical risks, future fertility, and future sexual function. This patient-led model of care with children takes precedence over the competency aspect of informed consent and tends to marginalize parental rights in medical decision-making for children. There is an alarming minimization of the significance of desistance rates and negative consequences of therapies. Risk-benefit assessments should include comparison with desistance rates in the absence of medical or surgical interventions, and should be weighed in view of the ethical principle of non-maleficence. First, do no harm. Desistance should be included in informed consent discussions. Despite these issues, there are some important points reinforced by the guidelines. This includes an acknowledgement of detransition and regret, and a statement of the need for more research to understand this cohort and improve patient selection. Most significant is the acknowledgement of the reality of comorbid mental health disorders and the importance of exploring and addressing such issues prior to initiating medical or surgical transition. This brings us back to the American Academy of Pediatrics Policy Statement. As we have shown, it relies on the Endocrine Society and WPATH guidelines, which have a weak evidence base. But the problems don't end there. One of the most criticized aspects of the paper is its mischaracterization of watchful waiting as outdated and withholding critical support. Watchful waiting is a term for the long-standing practice of providing exploratory therapy, social and family support for children with gender dysphoria, and addressing the underlying coexisting psychological conditions during childhood, allowing time which results in resolution of dysphoria in the majority of kids. The paper is able to characterize this process which produces resolution of dysphoria as problematic because it assumes that a preference for resolution of dysphoria through reconciliation with one's biologic sex and taking steps to allow that process to take place is a form of conversion therapy, and as such is both immoral and unethical in their view. This is where critics have pointed out potential problems with the citations used to support this claim. In supporting the points that conversion therapy for children with gender dysphoria is deleterious, unsuccessful, and outside the mainstream of medical practice, the paper cites 6 different references. The first citation, number 38, is a review of conversion therapy for sexual orientation in adults. Sexual orientation is separate and distinct from gender identity. Conclusions regarding sexual orientation in adults do not translate to gender identity in childhood. This citation does not support the conclusion for which it is used. Important differences between sexual orientation and gender dysphoria include homosexual or bisexual orientation in adults does not change by conversion therapy or any other intervention. Gender dysphoria in childhood desists in a large majority of cases. This fact is cited in several of the citations referenced in the AAP Policy Statement, but its significance in considering the ethical implications for irreversible medical and surgical treatments is absent from the paper. The second citation, number 29, is an American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry paper that is clear that in discussing conversion therapy, it is specifically addressing sexual orientation. Again, this is not relevant to childhood gender identity. In the American Academy of Pediatrics paper, Rafferty cites this reference to support the claim that affirmation is the only legitimate alternative for treating dysphoric children. However, the actual view of this reference is neutral on that question, noting a lack of evidence and pointing out that a large majority of children will resolve their dysphoria without hormones or surgery. What's more, while Rafferty's American Academy of Pediatrics paper rejected watchful waiting as outdated and outside the mainstream of clinical practice, this citation considers that approach to be the general therapeutic mode. As such, Rafferty's paper not only uses this citation to support a claim it does not make, it also withheld from readers the Academy of Childhood and Adolescent Psychiatry's actual view in support of watchful waiting. The third reference, number 39, is an editorial whose ultimate aim is to warn against making a false equivalence between conversion or reparative therapy for sexual orientation and legitimate therapy in children with gender dysphoria, especially when lawmakers enact legislation to make such therapy illegal. After pointing out that the original definition of conversion therapy has been expanded to encompass gender identity in the language of several regulations, the author warns that legislation aimed at restricting the practice of conversion therapies must be carefully worded to avoid restricting legitimate practices. As an example of such legitimate practices, the paper describes the Ontario Child, Youth and Family Gender Identity Service that was shut down due to such legislation. The clinic was widely regarded as one of the premier gender clinics internationally, and its approach included delay of affirmation in the watchful waiting paradigm with exploration of pre-existing trauma or mental illness. The author specifically states that delaying affirmation should not be construed as conversion therapy or an attempt to change gender identity. Once again, Rafferty's questionable use of a citation is at odds with its purpose and withholds the citation's position, which endorses watchful waiting. The next reference, number 40, is a review of how the treatment of children with gender dysphoria has changed in light of clinical experience, and how the demands and expectations of the increasingly younger patients have changed. It provides reasons for and against the use of puberty blockers and describes the author's rationale for lowering the age of hormones to 16, the Dutch age of majority. Even with these changes, the author still endorses the careful exploration of underlying trauma and any coexisting psychological issues in a lengthy period of screening that is in line with watchful waiting. The rationale for this cautious approach is the acknowledgement that a large majority of children with dysphoria will desist without hormones or surgery. The paper does not address conversion therapy at all for either gender dysphoria or sexual orientation. Again, the use of this citation by Rafferty in the Academy of Pediatrics position statement is puzzling and fails to acknowledge the support for watchful waiting as a legitimate approach for some patients. Reference 41 is a 2006 article which looks at the history of early conceptualization of gender-variant children, predominantly feminine boys, as pre-homosexual, and debates around early therapies focused on modifying gender-variant behavior. The therapies for modifying behavior did not address or consider gender dysphoria or gender identity, and were primarily focused on preventing children who exhibited gender-variant behavior from becoming homosexual adults. The paper tracks the debates around the formulation of the DSM-3 diagnosis of gender identity disorder in children, and concludes that there should be a shift towards a greater focus on addressing the psychosocial challenges of gender-variant children rather than foreclosing them into a predetermined outcome. This is the very process that watchful waiting and exploratory therapy allow to take place. Modern-day exploratory psychotherapy and watchful waiting are in no way comparable to early attempts at preventing homosexuality through behavior modification. Once again, the citation does not support Rafferty's position regarding conversion therapy for gender dysphoria in children. The final citation Rafferty gives in this segment is a single-paragraph statement from WPATH during the early stages of the American Psychiatry Association's update of the DSM, calling for the de-psychopathologization of gender diversity. The inclusion of gender identity disorder in the DSM has been debated since it first appeared, and there are reasonable arguments for and against it being removed, as homosexuality was previously. While not removing the diagnosis altogether, arguments such as this resulted in the change in the name of the diagnosis from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria in DSM-5, targeting the dysphoria rather than pathologizing gender identity per se. This change does not validate the inclusion of watchful waiting and exploratory psychotherapy under the umbrella of conversion therapy. Watchful waiting is not conversion therapy. These examples bring to light important points which should be kept in mind when referring to policy statements, guidelines, or standards of care. Recommendations should be based in quality evidence which justifies the irreversible changes, potential complications, and heavy future medical and psychological burden they entail. When very low or low quality evidence still results in strong recommendations for treatments in children, careful examination of the values and assumptions used to override the weak evidence base is warranted. The reality of desistance in a majority of dysphoric children and the more recent phenomenon of detransitioners should inform all aspects of analysis. If a majority of children desist with watchful waiting and without medical or surgical intervention, then that outcome should be a baseline with which to compare any other potential intervention. Watchful waiting is not conversion therapy. The alarming conflation of the two using irrelevant, contradictory, and misleading citations is a red flag that there has been a lapse in professional review at the American Academy of Pediatrics. The AAP Policy Statement is not a standard of care and should not be cited as such, or used to silence debate, delegitimize critics, restrict potential research, or bolster legislative action to either enforce affirmation or prevent watchful waiting. You cannot claim that all or even a majority of the over 60,000 members of the Academy of Pediatrics support the affirmation model of care outlined in this policy statement. It was authored by a single doctor within his first year out of residency and published without public review, approval, or commentary opportunity by the Academy at large. No minority opinion or public debate was allowed. All policy statements from the American Academy of Pediatrics automatically expire 5 years after publication unless reaffirmed, revised, or retired at or before that time. This statement was initially published in October of 2018 and should be up for expiration in 2023. Members of the Academy of Pediatrics are encouraged to examine the claims made in this video and by others on both sides of this issue and actively support efforts to update and revise this statement to better reflect the academic integrity and ethical principles of the Academy at large.
Ultimately, transitions care as needed for transgender individuals with appropriate assessment, as well as the fact that puberty blockers do not lead to permanent lifelong sterilization. And
Okay, this is the other statement she makes. Puberty blockers do not lead to lifelong sterilization, but we are learning that when you put a child on puberty blockers, 98 to 100% of them go on to cross-sex hormones, which, taken over time, leads to permanent sterilization. Significant number of them also go on to surgery, which includes hysterectomy or penectomy, that will lead to lifelong sterilization. And so the concept of Cascade Iatrogenesis, where you start one intervention that leads almost inevitably to future interventions, then that initial intervention carries with it all of the consequences of the subsequent interventions because it's the first car on the train. And so you could say, yes, puberty blockers do not cause permanent sterility. When you take a child with precocious puberty, you put them on puberty blockers for 2 years so that they age out into their normal puberty age, and then you take them off of puberty blockers and let them go through their normal physiologic puberty that is consistent with their natal gender, then there's no sterility. You've helped them overcome the challenges in bone growth, in all of the other issues that the early puberty carries in order to restore them to a normal process of development. That's a different concept than puberty blockers started for the phenomenon of gender dysphoria, left in for a number of years that exceeds what they would normally treat kids for precocious puberty for, and then add on top of that cross-sex hormones, which some clinicians call wrong sex hormones because you're providing sex hormones that their body is not physiologically meant to handle, because every cell in their body is anticipating the hormone that is consistent with their natal gender. And then there are all those consequences that happen after that. So I really get frustrated when she, and this happens multiple times, says that puberty blockers do not cause sterility. And it's a technically true statement, but it leaves out all of these other things.
So the way that we're using them is not related, like you said, because it's a combination. The combination of puberty blockers and then you're adding cross-sex hormones not nearly immediately, but in many cases, quite quickly afterward is a protocol that I don't think we can make a good comparison, certainly not to precocious puberty, which again, precocious puberty, not a psychological condition.
Yeah. And even if let's not even consider the cross-sex hormone dimension of it. What we're learning, the unknown consequences and side effects that we're now starting to see are very real, include the disruption of bone mineralization and bone growth that leads to premature osteoporosis and pathologic compression fractures. We're also seeing that the normal cognitive development that happens during puberty as your mind is maturing from a child to an adult, that process is disrupted because it relies on this complex milieu of hormones that are being disrupted by that. And the phenomenon that even WPATH is having to admit that by starting these kids on puberty blocking hormones when they show the very first signs of puberty, so that you prevent them from going through their normal sexual development, normal for their gender age, produces, in the case of young natal boys, the inability to orgasm.
The second was an observation that I had that every single child or adolescent who was truly blocked at Tanner stage 2 has never experienced orgasm. I mean, it's really about zero. These are just assigned male at birth, so trans feminine, and it's because they never in their lives are exposed to testosterone. That doesn't change. So blockers prevent the rise of testosterone, and they don't really go on testosterone at or around surgery or into adulthood. And so we don't know. They're going to have this sensation. There's no question about that. But are they going to be able to achieve sexual satisfaction? It's important in relationships. And I know that from my work with female genital mutilation survivors, that the lack of being able to be intimate with a partner is very important. And so this is what really raised the red flag for me, is to say, look, we need to have our eyes open about it. These are to be answered questions. So can we avoid puberty and get good adult results? And secondly, how do we assure someone that they're going to be able to be sexually responsive? Do we remove the blockers during the course of their adolescence and let a little bit of puberty come back? Do we delay it a little bit, maybe into Tanner's 3 or 4, maybe before they have their first orgasms, maybe?
Well, how is that degree of sexual function that follows them throughout the rest of their life going to affect their fertility? And that's just on the puberty blocker itself. And so her statements that are just so glib and just handed out reflect to me that same degree of incuriosity about, are these statements actually true? Can I just simply point to the American Academy of Pediatrics and the 10,000 names on their rolls and say, this proves that we don't have to think about this question anymore, and we can just blindly follow these guidelines that, oh, by the way, they're not really guidelines?
I think that in the best case scenario, the answer would be, we don't know, right? We don't actually know, because it would be unethical to put somebody on puberty blockers for, let's say, 5 years. And then the idea is that after they've decided what they're going to do, and they say, no, I'm going to continue being a girl. And they went from, let's say, age 10 to age 15, that magically puberty is going to start again. We've never done that experiment because it's unethical. And we don't actually know what would happen. I'm not sure that information is something that we have. Maybe if we dug into the clinical trials on Lupron, or we dug into the puberty blocker trials, although I'm going to guess that there were so many other impacts besides what would have equaled sterility that they probably stopped. They probably intervened and said, we really shouldn't go any further. So at best case, she should say, we don't know.
And if you understand that these kids are put on a pathway that leads them to these subsequent interventions, they are going to get sterilized anyway in the future, in the form of these bottom surgeries, which are euphemistic pleasantries for sterilization, surgical sterilization.
Even if they don't have surgery, what will happen is, if you suppress the estrogen production in a female and you inject testosterone, you're going to have a uterus that doesn't have any nutrients to survive, and it will atrophy and die inside a girl's body. And then it will have to be removed, generally within 5 years of testosterone. So that in itself will cause sterility, because you're going to have to remove the uterus.
That's those risk factors that we're expecting these teenage kids and their families to understand. But
Again, this is experimental. What you were saying, it's interesting, because we're having this discussion about what's the impact of puberty blockers. They are truly experimenting on children. There really are such a various ways that they intervene, depending on if a child comes to them 5 years old, 8 years old, their parent brings them in 10, sometimes 15, sometimes 18 they go in.
It occurs to me that there's something that is touted as a big positive to the approach of this that actually reveals what you just said, which is this idea that it has to be highly individualized, highly specialized. Every child is different. And when you take that idea that every child is different, it's highly specialized, highly individualized, that means that you're not identifying criteria for a specific clinical pathway that has been tested, and we know the efficacy of it, and we know the benefits and the risks of it, and we can say that we are not doing harm, or that we are doing more benefit than the degree of harm. Because everything is so specialized and atomized into these individuals, then you have lost the benefit of the evidence base that you would use to justify the intervention in the first place.
Yeah, standard intervention, standard.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is a better word besides individualized care is curated. You're curating an identity. You're curating a gender identity. And there are people who will say that, of course, the post-18 crowd will say, I took enough testosterone to get the voice that I wanted, and now I've stopped. Or I just wanted a flat chest so I could go to the beach and take off my shirt. I actually am not interested in injecting testosterone at all. I just wanted my breasts gone. They're curating their, quote, gender identity.
In a state that won't allow tattoos for kids. All right, so let's keep going here.
I feel like we have to start with the at least what the mainstream medical association's standards are. And whether you disagree with them or feel like they're gray or not, this bill comes down on a specific side against mainstream medical association opinion. And thus the burden of proof that they are wrong does fall to those who support this bill. And so I really want to make sure that is understood in the idea that we all agree that this is an individualized care of these children is very individualized. And I'm super concerned about saying it's the state that has to come in, choose a specific side, criminalize what is considered to be mainstream care based on small groups of outlier statements. And I'm just really worried about that. And I know that you believe it's individualized care. I want to make sure that's something that people hear. And I don't know if that's it's a question. But I do have a question.
May I respond to that?
Oh, go ahead. Sure.
Because if we go too far down the road, I'm going to forget what you just said.
I know.
I'm getting old.
It was a lot.
Through the chair to Representative Liston, again, I have a huge amount of respect for you. However, I'm going to counter some of the things that you just said. Calling the American College of Pediatricians conservative is no different than calling the APA liberal. No,
One is an advocacy group and one is a professional organization.
Let's
Sorry.
stick to answering the question, please, Representative Click.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I thought that was an answer to that.
No, you're talking to me. It was
Okay.
me.
Are we following up then?
So on that side, so I'm just saying they are an organization made up of professionals. They're doctors. They're not activists. And do you recognize the DSM-4 and DSM-5? Are they authoritative? Through the chair.
DSM-5 is a diagnostic manual of psychiatric diseases, and DSM-5 is the most recent version. It is how we definitionally look at disorders.
You recognize that as credible through the chair. Dr. Kenneth Zucker is the one who chaired this section, and he advocates for the same things we're talking about in this bill.
For criminalizing.
For the treatment. I think for criminalizing.
For watchful waiting as a component.
Address questions through the chair, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying.
Oh, or either. Through the chair, please. Did you have a follow-up question, Representative Liston?
I have a separate question. It's a totally different topic, but within the bill, I'm really.
They side-skirted his point there, which is that she's trying to paint the picture that it's only these conservative activist groups that have any dissenting voice on this issue. Everybody else, the American Academy of Pediatrics, says that we should do affirmation only and put these kids down this pathway. And he's pointing out that even respected professionals who are so respected that they have guided the very manuals that define these things have an opinion about how we should treat children, which differs from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which drives this affirmation model, which is what we're trying to safeguard kids against, because we consider it to be an experimental. Rather than acknowledging that point, that you can't simply paint the critics of this process as fringe outsiders who are activists. She tries to turn it into, we're talking about criminalizing. I think her point is important in terms of the question of whether this should be a criminal thing or whether it should be a regulatory sanction or license sanction thing is up for debate. And I think that eventually gets massaged a little bit. But I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that he's making the point there are legitimate, respected professionals who differ in opinion on this.
Yeah, the idea that we should just have one association or even two associations guide that, I think is false. I think that's the entire point of testimony and hearings, is that we hear from a variety of people, individuals, some of them representing groups, some of them representing themselves as practitioners and their years of experience. That the idea is that we're not just listening to a body, a couple of bodies, even three bodies, that we do take into account a variety of pieces of evidence when we try to make decisions for public policy.
Yeah, very good. Okay, let's keep going.
Concerned about the component that says teachers and counselors can't talk about specific things, that they're not allowed. This law dictates what teachers and counselors can say to their children that they're working with in crisis. And that is that component of this bill I'm really concerned about. I don't know why it's in here that says that they're not allowed to say or they're not allowed to say specific things. They have to alert individuals if a student comes and says that they're concerned about gender dysphoria. You've already alluded to the fact that some of these kids may be in unsafe circumstances, and we're taking that judgment out of that counselor's hands in terms of how to best proceed through this law. And I don't know what your thoughts are.
Through the chair to the representative, just one aside to the last one, we will have medical professionals who will come in and who will be better able to discuss some of your prior questions much better than I am. And I look forward to that. And again, you and I have had conversations before, and I think you and I are very like-minded in that we care about people. Sometimes we just come at it from a different way or come to a different means of achieving that. And the discussion, and please, thank you for the questions. I do appreciate the questions because I know they come from your heart and they come from a good place. And that's not an issue with me. But when you're talking about the school counselors, I have talked to people. I have firsthand knowledge of at least 2 schools in Ohio where a child goes to school as their birth gender. The school facilitates them socially transitioning during school hours, and then before school, and using their preferred names, their preferred pronouns, and so forth, and then it changes back before they go home, and their parents are none the wiser. And so with this bill, what that portion of the bill that you're addressing says is schools can't take over for the parents. Parents have the primary responsibility for their children, and those counselors are hiding that from the parents. And in fact, the teacher is forbidden. The teacher in a parent-teacher conference, when talking to that child's parents, is not allowed to use pronouns, must only use the child's given name, and is forbidden from telling the parents what their child is going through. Parents are responsible for the children, not the state of Ohio. And when you conceal that, and we're not telling them how they can counsel, but we're telling them you cannot keep this information from parents. Now, you can invite the parents in, and you can say, hey, listen, we have something to discuss. And that counselor can provide whatever advice that they think is appropriate to the parents and to the child, facilitate a social transition. We're not saying they can't do the social transition in school. We're saying you just can't do it behind the parents' backs.
Follow-up?
All right.
One of my
What do you
favorite
think?
topics. I'll let you talk first.
Okay. There's a couple of things. This thread comes again and again, which is that if we prevent school counselors from helping these kids in distress live their real life, then the families are abusive. And the counselors have to paternalistically take care of the kids because the families are hateful, bigots, and abusive. Because if you don't affirm, then you're abusive, and the parents are abusive. And so there's this built-in assumption that the families are abusive, and that justifies counselors and the state taking over the role of what types of interventions happen in the lives of these kids. Make no mistake about it, social transition is a psychological intervention. And Ken Zucker, who he's talked about before, makes this case, and again, because that is one of the interventions that derails the normal process of very high rates of desistance of prepubertal and adolescent gender dysphoria. And so doing that, having the school counselor and the teachers complicit in a process of hiding information relevant to a child's development from the parents that constitutes a significant psychological intervention under the heading that the parents are in an abusive household and would somehow hurt the child if they knew, is the state clearly overstepping its bounds. It's establishing a guilty until proven innocent that the parents are abusive. And it's just blowing apart the definition of what constitutes abuse so that the state can do anything under that heading of the parents are abusive. So we're justified in hiding this information from them that is relevant to them. And he mentions some real life experiences. If you start paying attention to this realm of parents reporting their experiences with school counselors and teachers, this is not infrequent. This is happening all over the place. And it is counselors who have no role, have no training or expertise in dealing with this very complex issue, taking it upon themselves to do an intervention in the lives of kids that I think is an unethical and a violation of the rights of the parents. That's all I have to say.
So this hits, like I said, two of my favorite topics, and I'll elaborate on the same two things that you brought up, which is one, there are criteria for abuse and neglect, and teachers are mandated reporters for abuse and neglect. If it meets the criteria, you think it meets the criteria, you report it to Child Protective Services or Department of Child Family Services, whatever it's called in your state. And then it goes over to that department. They investigate. They determine, that department, that government agency determines whether there's a valid concern and the case should be opened, and then, or it gets dismissed, that there is no findings of abuse or neglect. And let's say that continues with the investigation, the next step, and we see a misinformation, and I hate that term, but true misinformation about what happens when a parent is investigated by Child Protective Services. They say, okay, we have found this finding. If it's an immediate safety concern, the child may be removed from the home for a temporary period for the parent to be able to do the interventions required by the state, which is an explicit list of items that they must comply with. Vast majority of the time, children are absolutely not removed from that home. The parent still meets with the social workers and has to follow up with a bunch of requirements to say, yes, I have done this. Yes, I have done this. And I have either changed my behavior, I've changed the way that the home is, I've taken the classes that you require, and I have now demonstrated that I can comply with these things. And my child is no longer in a home that is considered abusive or neglectful. Most of the time, we're talking about physical things. So there's no list of criteria that says that I think that it's imminently possible that this parent is going to abuse this child. No, that's not a thing in the list of criteria, that I think that this child is imminently going to be kicked out of their house for if they come out as trans. Nope, not a thing. We can't take kids away for the possibility, the remote possibility that something bad could happen to them. That's not how it works. So there is a real process for Child Protective Services, and teachers, if they suspect abuse or neglect, should follow the protocol and report it to Child Protective Services and have them do their job if they honestly suspect abuse or neglect, given the criteria that they were trained in. So that's number one. They can't take on the role of another agency. That is not within the bounds of their contracts. Secondly, like you said, they are performing an intervention. And unless there is an individualized educational plan or a 504 plan or something like that that dictates that they're supposed to intervene given a diagnosis that is somehow on file with the school, just like a medication that the child needs to take, this is a treatment, an intervention. And I'm not sure that a teacher or a counselor has the authority to be able to give treatments to a child, whether it's physical treatments of dispensing a medication or a psychological treatment, such as calling somebody by a pronoun that does not correspond to their biological sex. That's a treatment. And of course, anybody would say that social transition is part of the treatment plan of somebody. Let's say, if you believe in the guidelines, then you would say that's part of the treatment plan. And so that should be written down somewhere, that the teacher is then participating in a treatment plan. They are consenting to participating in the treatment plan, that it is part of their contract as a counselor or teacher to participate in that plan, and that they are actually intervening. So let's think of another scenario where a child has depression, for example, has been diagnosed with a general depression, and there's some intervention that the parent wants the school to take. I would say that there has to be something in place if you're going to require teachers to intervene and participate in some sort of treatment plan for your child's depression. Otherwise, the school should be treating your child just like it treats every other child, because that's medical information of a diagnosis that the school either keeps on file and is participating in the treatment, or doesn't have any diagnostic criteria to say that they should be intervening in any other way.
No, I love that framing of it as we should look at those interventions in the same paradigm where there needs to be a 504 on file that has involved a specific diagnosis with specific criteria, that the schools should really see that process as protective of them as well. That way they're
Yes.
not going to be liable to any
Yes.
subsequent lawsuits, which we're
Yes.
starting to see lawsuits come up about this. All right, let's keep going with the discussion here. That's one exchange that we're going to see come up again and again, because there's this idea that the parents are abusive. And I just love what you said about that. Is if they're abusive, then you should have already initiated that process, because that process is in place and you're a mandated reporter. And if things have not met that criteria where you're going to initiate that process, you should not invoke that they have an abusive household and under any heading at all.
It's one or the other. That's the thing. It's one or the other. If you suspect, you report. If there's no criteria for suspicion, why are we talking about it?
Exactly. All right, let's keep going.
My concern is in those circumstances where the now teacher has to tell a child who's in an abusive situation that they must disclose their gender concerns. And that bill actually says that the teacher's not allowed to say, or the counselor's not allowed to say otherwise, that they have to say, you must disclose, or you need to disclose this to your parents.
They're not, through the chair, they're not allowed to they're not allowed to encourage the children to keep it from their parents, is what they're not allowed to say. Oh, Susie, don't tell your parents. Johnny, don't tell you. They're not allowed to say that. They're not allowed to encourage that. And I think what happens is we are presuming, and we know that there's some children who come from some difficult circumstances, and no one.
Okay, before he gets to that, though, having an adult in a school instruct a child to hide something from their parents.
That's grooming.
In any heading, any other heading, people would say, that sounds like grooming behavior. What you're doing is you're trying to change and alter the child's normal relationships
Trusting
to carve out a hidden space. Their long-term family relationships, to carve out a hidden space that they can exist with an adult. And that is a vulnerable space for abuse to happen. And so it's just to hear Representative Liston, who is a pediatrician, a physician, not think about what she's saying and how that would play out is difficult.
Negligent,
This
I
is,
would say.
yeah, this is one of, I think, her argument points that tells something about just how one-sided she's approaching this. All right. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that grooming point.
We already went over she's saying the child may already be in an abusive home. I'm not sure how that was determined. And
Yeah,
then
exactly.
secondly, the part in the bill that says the teacher cannot say, don't tell your parents.
Why would she have a problem with that?
Not sure. I think she only thinks that because she thinks nothing's kept from her. Okay. I can understand how nobody who's been blindsided by information that's been kept from them. Of course, there might be a bunch of information that is being kept from her and she just doesn't know it yet. Child should have multiple relationships with adults that are trusting, and those adults should communicate with each other for the best interests of the child. That's how natural relationships work, where a child learns to trust not just their own immediate family, hopefully, and builds the concept of trust and attachment, but then grows that through relationships at school. That's the next step, which is you get to know your neighbors, you get to know people at school, and you say, hey, it's not just my mom and my dad and my sisters and brothers who I can trust. I can also trust extended family members. They're consistent in their behavior. And then I can go out to the school and the teachers and I go, okay, I did this. And then this was the response. And it's a consistent, trusting relationship. And what she's describing is a wedge that makes a child doubt not just their parent, but maybe everyone. And it might be at a developmental stage that they're not quite capable of discerning who is trustworthy and who is not. It could lead them down all kinds of other disorders, I'm sure, most of which I think are centered around the anxiety of unpredictability. If somebody says, I know that you trust your mom and she seems like a nice person, but beware. I don't think you should share this with her. You should maybe trust me more. I don't think that's quite right.
And that's the type of behavior that we've seen happen again and again in abusive situations of outsiders to a family preying upon vulnerable kids. And that's why that accusation of this being a form of grooming can be compelling to people who first encounter this, because it's in no other context would we feel like it's okay for a school counselor to tell a child to hide something from their parents.
Of course.
So that's a strong argument on this
Yeah,
case. All right.
it is that whole come sit on my lap, don't tell your mom we did this. It's the same thing. Don't tell your mom, keep a secret from an adult. Doesn't make sense.
The red
Every
flag.
adult should be, like I said, in the interest of the child. They should all be communicating with each other for the benefit of the child. That's normal. It's not
And
normal
let's
to have
start
visual-
out with the supposition that the parents are incapable of really making this judgment for themselves, or they are themselves abusive, which, since Representative Liston is arguing this point, that is the perspective you have to argue the point from, is that the parents are incapable of dealing with this experience of dysphoria in their child as parents. And so the school counselors need to do that for them.
Yeah.
And we see that phenomenon happening on TikTok where teachers and counselors are complaining because the fact that they used to do this is no longer allowed. So we know it happens, in addition to the anecdotes that Representative Click brings.
The problem is that it's assuming a hierarchy of trust instead of a kind of a network of trust or a network of supportive adults in a child's life. So the idea that somehow my opinion or my belief or my idea is somehow better than somebody else's, whether I am a parent, a teacher, or somebody else, I don't know. As a parent, I was a person who said, yeah, this is what I think to my daughter. This is what I think. Go ask that person. And that person will say, your mom might think differently about this. And she thinks that, and I think this. And it's up to you to decide what you think. That's a normal kind of flat way of looking at everybody's opinion as somehow having some equal value. And we all have different ideas about what's best. And at the end of the day, certainly what Representative Click says is parents have the authority over the medical and psychological and educational decision-making of their children.
Okay, let's keep going.
Denies that. If the children are coming from difficult circumstances, that might be one of the comorbidities that is leading them to this, and they're only facilitating it rather than dealing with it. But
That's such an important point there, is that listening to the stories of detransitioners, in some cases, it is abuse that's happening in the home that's causing the dysphoria, that's causing the reaching out. And if you're telling that people to hide that from their parents and to go down this pathway, then you may be creating a future detransitioner, because the dysphoria is not what people would consider true trans dysphoria. It's a maladaptive coping mechanism for real abuse that's happening that's not related to gender identity. All right, let's keep going.
But we cannot presume that every parent is a bad parent. And when schools do that, they are automatically presuming that they know better than the parents. And this is why, just look over in Virginia at all the people that were in such an uproar over at the schools. The schools thought they knew better than the parents. No school knows better than me for my children. No school knows better than you for your children. And we cannot let schools come in between parents and their children. That is a grievous error in our society when we allow that to happen.
Are there any additional questions for the sponsor? Seeing none, thank you very much for your time, Representative Click, and
Chair.
thank you for addressing through the chair. I appreciate that.
Okay, so that's the end of Representative Click's opening session. His point at the end is really good. And when you look at social movements that have spread like wildfire in different countries, you'll hear a lot of people accuse different social justice factions of being Marxist or being communist or something like that. Those historical allusions, some people may find lesser or more weight in it. I think the allusion that is more appropriately made is really what happened in the Cultural Revolution in China. And that is where political faction and the state did get in between families and their children. Maoism is rooted very strongly in having the societal institutions take over the rearing and upbringing of children. And so that is why, if you study the Cultural Revolution of China, you'll see the children turned against their parents because they were indoctrinated every day with ideas rooted in the philosophy of the leader and that political ideology. And the children were told that if the parents didn't fall in line, that they were enemies both to the child and to the state as a whole, and they should turn in their parents. One of the videos that I posted on my channel was a young teenage boy who, in the fervor of the Cultural Revolution, his mother spoke out against the Chairman Mao, and he having been instructed and indoctrinated at the school, turned in his mom and demanded that she be executed, and she was executed. And he has come to grips with the reality that he was swept up in that movement at the time and now regrets it very deeply. But it's an extreme example of what can go wrong when we take away the stewardship of the upbringing of a child from their parents and allow the state to intervene and take over that. Some people may find that more or less relevant to this discussion, but it's at least an extreme example of that.
I think the argument, though, that last point that he's trying to make is that parents should have authority over decision making around their children, and the state doesn't have that authority. People would describe that as some sort of right-wing conservative argument. What's interesting is that the mechanism that we use, we actually have a mechanism for checks and balances on that. And there's two parts to that. One, which we've already discussed, is Child Protective Services. The other is schooling. The only real mechanism of mandated reporters are in two places. The vast majority of abuse is reported by schooling, teachers, counselors, people who are inside schools. So when children show up to schools, that is the general reporting structure, because it's less often that they'll go to doctors' offices, also mandated reporters. But if you have children who do not actually go to school because they are homeschooled or because their parents have just simply removed them from the schooling system, and maybe they aren't even homeschooling at all, that mechanism falls apart. And there's a lot of people, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education is one, who is interested in figuring out how to fill that gap for homeschoolers, to make sure that there is some sort of way and mechanism to investigate abuse or neglect, whether that's physical or psychological, for children who are in the homeschooling realm. To say that there is some problem or say that the mandated reporters are not fulfilling their function is a little bit scary in itself. This assumption that somehow that there's no reporting structure or that there's no relationship, that parents are saying, no, I have the authority over everything that happens to my child, even when I send them to school. And that somehow that's a right-wing conservative idea. I don't think parents are saying that. I don't think any parent is saying that when I send my child to school, I want to dictate what pencils they use and everything that happens to them throughout the day and micromanage everything that you say and do with my child. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an intervention, not only into the lives of children who are in distress over this concept of gender that is currently popular, but that there are other things that are being forced upon other children also in the classroom that are impacting the rest of the whole group, not just your child in the intervention, that maybe you have said, okay, it's fine if you use these pronouns. Sure. Okay. Maybe you don't know, but you wouldn't care anyway. But other interventions are coming into other children's lives where they are being coerced or forced or socially pressured to use wrong sex pronouns for children. And that's real harm that we're subjecting all children to. I know that in the case of my child, who was, quote, the first trans kid at her school, and this was a big celebration and it's such an experiment that they were doing, which is fascinating. They sent out emails to everybody in that whole school to say, this is now this child's name, and these are the pronouns that you're going to use. And this is what you're going to do. And I found it so fascinating that everybody got this email and thought, okay, I have to do this. But I wonder now, because that was some years ago, I wonder now whether the school sends out emails for every kid who says they're trans. Do they? I'm not sure. So in some ways, did they include parents in that process? I'm not sure that the other parents, not me, but the other parents had any decision-making authority over whether or not their child participated in the treatment plan of my child. I don't think they did have a choice there. And certainly today, I don't even think emails are going out that say, hey, we have a new list of 7 trans students this month. And so these are their names, these are their pronouns, and please put them on the list of all the children who you have.
Having flashbacks to those COVID emails we used to get about COVID diagnoses. So I had 3 kids diagnosed with COVID. Again. That's a very good point in terms of the interventions involved now compelling other students and other teachers to adopt a belief system and act on that belief system that they maybe have not considered or adopted themselves personally. Because the idea that people can be born in the wrong body and that you have to reshape your language and your social interactions around that metaphysical belief is not shared by everyone. And there are some people who, for religious or secular or scientific reasons, would say, I don't actually agree with that, and I don't want to compel my children to participate in the consequences of such a belief. And I agree with you. I don't think the schools considered that ethical consideration. It's similar to when you listen to women in the UK that have spoke out about how in the adult population, when men transition, they are told then to go into women's restrooms and women's spaces. And a lot of the women are saying, hold on a second, we did not consent to that. Adopted an intervention in the lives of these individuals, but didn't bother to consider the rights and expectations and safety of the people who occupy those spaces that they would go in and do that. And that's an ethical conversation we need to have. So we made it through Representative Click's introductory statement and Q&A session.
Congratulations to us. We did it in 2 days.